Brilliant. So good morning, everybody, or good evening, good night, wherever you might be in the world. Welcome to session 6 of our Responsible Raw Materials Annual Conference, the ESG or Environment, Social Governance Toolbox for Responsible Sourcing. Hopefully you're as excited as we are with regards to what's about to happen in this session here today, because it's a really, really good one that we've got lined up for you this morning. And then, of course, we've got another one this afternoon. Now, we are acutely aware that some people are, of course, juggling conferences because there's another sustainable mining conference that's going on based in Chile at the moment. So if you've been up all night watching all of their fantastic videos and listening to their panel sessions, thank you so, so much for coming across to us as well. We really very much appreciate it. Just in case you have missed anything over the course of the past week, everything is being recorded. So just as a warning, everything is being recorded now and streamed live to YouTube. And the team is doing an amazing job at editing those videos almost as soon as they have been recorded and then embedding them into the speaker's abstract. So you can go back and you can check out all of those talks that you may have missed over the course of the past few days. So just to give you a recap as to what we've been up to, and that's what I'm going to use the next 10-15 minutes or so. It's just to give us a recap and a reset almost as to where we've got to in this conference, and also some of those key messages that we've been hearing coming through from all of those fantastic talks. Because then, of course, we go into the fantastic Alexander Stafford, Member of Parliament, who's going to be giving us an insight into the UK's mineral strategy, or at least something along those lines, which will be very exciting. I'm sure you will all agree. I'm also seeing that some of our wonderful speakers are just dialing in now. Don't worry, we will not leave you to languish in the world of attendees. Not that that is a bad world to be in. Rose will spot you in that list and she'll be able to move you across into the panelists list so that you can say hello to all of us. So hi, Jeff, really good to have you with us. Now, with regards to what we've been up to over the past week, if I just quickly share the website so that you can see what has been going on. So this is the Responsible Raw Materials website. In case you haven't found it, it is just www.responsiblerawmaterials.com. And if you go into there, you will see, here's the homepage. You will see if you scroll down, there's a little link across to this year's conference. So you can go into it by clicking on that button there. Or of course, you can click on the main tab at the top of the screen. Now, what we've got here, of course, are all the links, and you can also watch the conference live on YouTube. And it's been absolutely brilliant to see loads of engagement on YouTube and lots of people going back and watching the sessions after they've finished as well. So absolutely fantastic to see that that is all working. Now, you will all have noticed that we have our little infographic here around which this conference is based. And a massive thank you to everybody who has been suggesting stakeholders and tools and techniques that we've missed from this infographic. The infographic is there to be updated, and we will be providing an updated version of this after the conference, because I think Rose and myself and the rest of the team who put this together always knew that there would be stuff that we would have missed here, which is one of the purposes of running the conference. So if you think we are missing something within this infographic, please do feel free to feed it through to us and we will magically make it appear. I think, Rose, every time we go back and we redo this, the infographic expands. So I'm really excited to see what sort of new mountains, for example, emerge in the background there. Perhaps we might have another river, who knows, or maybe a bit more of a beach this time. So I'm really excited to see the next iteration of our infographic. The infographic is freely available for absolutely anybody to use. So if you think it would be useful for you to use in any of your materials, we will provide a really nice high resolution downloadable version for you, or just contact Rose at hello@responsiblerawmaterials to be able to get your copy, or just take a print screen. It's fine. You can use it in any which way you like. We are not precious with regards to this, because at the end of the day, this is all about collaboration and the word of the conference, which is, of course, co-creation. Okay, so co-creation, and that's what we want to do here. We want to come together and share all of our ideas. So we have the infographic. Please help us to update all of that. With regards to the schedule, so you'll see that this has been ever so slightly changing as we've gone through the week, but we have been absolutely delighted to say that we are now 5 sessions in. So this is session number 6, because of course we are on Thursday the 13th of May, lucky for some, Thursday the 13th of May. And so far, every single one of our speakers has managed to dial in time. And whilst there have been 1 or 2 sharing issues with regards to slides, hopefully we've managed to navigate those seamlessly. I say slightly wincing. There have been talks where we've had some problems potentially with screening videos. What we have done is go back, find the raw videos and embed them in the recording. So it's a bit more pleasant for you to watch back. What we found off the back of our conference from last year is because our talks are only 10 minutes long with then 10 minutes of questions. So they're 20-minute little bite-sized snapshots. What teachers and lecturers and different organizations have done is they've been making use of these little recordings together with their abstracts in their teaching material. And we really do encourage you to do this. Everything is freely available for you to do whatever you would like with it. So please do feel free to make use of them. Please do feel free to engage with those speakers directly. I'm sure most of them are on platforms such as LinkedIn if they haven't posted their email addresses within their abstracts. The purpose of Responsible Raw Materials is really to bring together a wide variety of fantastic people across the raw materials space, and of course those who perhaps don't have the luxury of working inside raw materials, but of course have an interest and so want to find out more and perhaps want to influence the evolution of this space as a whole. So we really do encourage people to engage with all of this material. Now, I mentioned abstracts, and you might say, what on earth do you mean by these abstracts? Well, you can see there's a little button that says all abstracts can be found here. So if I click on that, that will take us to, and I always feel ill in that little transition rate, and that takes us to this year's conference page. So what you can see are all of our lovely speakers with the titles of their talks lined up. Okay, so we can see this morning's talk with Alexander kicking us off in 10 minutes or so. Looking at what's going on in the UK, followed by the phenomenal Professor Francis Wall, who's going to be giving us insight into what is going on in the circular economy and evolutions in that space. So you can see the schedule up there, and then down below it, you'll be able to find all of the lovely abstracts. Now, why are we excited by this? Well, you can see that in lots of the abstracts, there's a little recording sign that is beginning to appear. And so yesterday morning, those of you who dialed in may remember that we had a session called Bursting the Bubble. And this was very intentional because what often happens is, of course, lots of us have the luxury of working in raw materials, be us people who work in mining, or we might work further down that value chain in anything from recycling or the designing of batteries, for example. We might be academics, innovators, we might be investors, insurers, what have you, NGOs, etc. And what we tried to do with the Bursting the Bubble session, and I'm just going to click on that now, is bring together some very brave individuals because we invited 4 individuals, all of whom we knew may well have an opinion on raw materials. We had no idea what their opinion might be, but the fantastic interviewer, Åsa Borson, interviewed them and posed some key questions. Okay, and what you can see here are the questions that also posed to our panel of experts. And what we have here is that panel uploaded already, so you can just click on the play button and to watch some of their comments. From the top of my head, key comments that really resonated with me included Lensa's finishing remarks were along the lines of, let's put the hearts back into mining. Through to things, I think Maria mentioned the fact that, yep, she was talking to us on her computer and she certainly wasn't going to give that back to anybody. So whilst mining might have a bad reputation, etc., and there was quite a lot of discussion around whether the panel thought that mining was good or bad, and what did that really mean? It was the fact that actually we need the materials that come out of the ground. And I think one of the main comments that sits in my mind from the back of yesterday was, it is not so society, and I say that grandly, given that we only had 4 members of society, and we have a slightly larger population than that in the world. So given that we had representatives of society here, what they said was that we don't have a problem with mining. It is the context of mining. And that is something that I think we are really, really seeing throughout the conference as a whole. So really trying to get to grips with what is the context in which organizations are finding, are extracting, processing, selling raw materials from the ground, and how do we really get the circular economy to truly work, but actually see it for what it can do, but also what it can't do as well. So with regards to that, please do feel free to go and check it out on the website. So you see that the team are really keeping up with posting those nice little videos into those abstracts. If you're struggling to be able to navigate those conference talks on this page here, if you go into learning material and talks there, you will see every single talk that we've ever recorded in Responsible Raw Materials. So we've been going for 12 months now. We're a voluntary organisation, not for profit. So the organising team are doing this because we're all passionate about trying to make sure that we actually look after our raw materials that we extract from the ground. Many of us either work or have worked within, say, mining, processing, product design, etc. And so we all totally understand that we need these raw materials, but we're all passionate about trying to make sure that we do extract and look after those raw materials in the most responsible way, whatever that might mean. So if you're struggling to find what you're looking for, another way in is to click on the talks page. And what you will find here is a very handy search button. Okay, so if I search for, I'm going to be really egotistical and search for myself. Okay, so this is a little talk that I gave yesterday. Okay, so if I click on that, you will see that again, the team, checking it out, Rose, this is amazing. You know full well that I'm probably going to click on the one that we haven't done yet. You can see that there's the little video that I gave yesterday with my other hat on, okay, and what I do in the rest of my job or in my other job working for Satala, which is a risk management organization. So you can see there's loads and loads of different ways we can look at this. And also as well, if you are, say, interested in artisanal and small scale mining, you're thinking, what on earth do the letters ASM mean when they're in conjunction with one another? You can see here that we're also searching through the talks and we're posting them so that if you do want to go and give yourself a little crash course in what is meant by artisanal and small scale mining by some of the world's leading experts. And I really do say that this array of people that we have on the screen here in terms of their abstracts, they truly, truly do give you an insight as to what ASM really looks like. And there will be more talks going up here from this year's conference because artisanal and small scale mining has been a hot topic of conversation. And that's important because often when people think about mines, they just think about a big hole in the ground. Whereas actually the vast majority of people who work in the mining industry globally do it on an artisanal or a small scale mining level. Okay, so we do it in a much smaller way. It's not just the big companies that we're talking about here. And that takes me on to the competition that we are running at the moment, as in what do we imagine when we think about a mine? What does that actually look like? What does it feel like inside us? And last year at the conference that we ran, we set up a little competition actually halfway through the week because it was inspired by one of our speakers that we had. And this talk, this competition that we set up allowed us to look at what are our perspectives with regards to mining. And we asked people to send us in drawings of what they thought a mine looked like. Now, bearing in mind this time last year, I think lockdown had become boring already, but we had no idea what was in store for us. So in a way, it was still kind of exciting. And actually at the beginning of every session, we were still doing an introduction to Zoom and how to add things into chat or into the Q&A and things like that. And you'll have noticed that we don't need to do that anymore because I think we might all be experts in this space. So we asked people, what do you think a mine looks like? And these are some of the pictures that we got back. And they varied hugely. They were brilliant. So we had things like, you can tell that this person up here, I suspect, is an engineer. They've drawn a lovely little flow chart. This person over here, I know, is a geologist. Okay, we've got the 3 dimensions going on there and the use of coloured pencils. So that was truly glorious. And then all the way through to many other individuals. So this picture down here, we have intentionally covered up a certain word. So if you are eagle-eyed and you can see that what they say Maggie Thatcher might be, yes, this person does come from the Midlands in the UK, and so grew up with all of the coal mining and everything that went on in the 1980s there. So we're seeing the political aspects and very emotional aspects coming into this as well. Other pictures, you can see people sent in pictures. People drew tunnels under the ground. I think this one here was actually my 3-year-old nephew. So well done, Drew. That is a phenomenal drawing of a mine. I'm very proud of this one over here. We've got drawings where we're also talking about the local communities, the whole supply chain, just submitted. It looks like this one was drawn on the back of a bill. So that's a good use of an envelope, all the way through into a wide variety of different pictures. And actually we continued on this competition throughout the course of the year in different contexts. Now, why am I showing you these pictures? Well, I'm showing you them because this year we're inviting people to send in drawings of what they think a responsible mine looks like. Now, it might look exactly the same. So you could submit the same picture if you can find it from last year, or it might look totally different. And some of the entries that we've had already are really quite abstract. We've had some beautiful drawings of flowers and bees and stuff like that, and through to people who have drawn really quite complicated automated technology. So using machinery that allows us to mine deep underneath the surface of the ground without human beings going down there, and there being very little surface expression. So that's really, really exciting to see. So this is a case here where there are lots and lots of different ways that we can picture these mines, and what we would encourage you to do. And as you can see, yes, this was something for all of the family. So if you happen to have little people at home because their nursery or their school happens to have had an outbreak of COVID, or even a scare with regards to COVID, then this could be a nice little activity for them at the moment. Or if you're just sitting there doodling on your pad, and I know that Ruth has been waking up in the middle of the night with inspiration as to what she is going to draw and submit into this competition. So please do send these in to hello@responsiblerawmaterials.com, not just because it's a bit of fun to see what's going on, but it gives us really good insight into the different perspectives of how different people view mining. Okay, what do people actually think about it? And I will take a moment later on today, Rose, to submit my hopefully award-winning entry. That is no hint whatsoever, all fantastic. The final thing to mention just before I introduce our first fantastic speaker is that we have received some fantastic sponsorship, which we of course put into paying for things like the Zoom license and the website. But more importantly, we've used it to pay for some training for next week. So what we have is we're running a few training courses on responsible mining and integrated risk management in mining. And we can offer seats on these training courses for free. So if you would like some formal training in this area, or if you have colleagues who you think could do with some training, then please get in touch with us either at hello@responsiblerawmaterials or email Ellen, because Ellen is the lady in charge of training. She is the person to be nice to about this. And Ellen's email address is ellen@satala.com. So please do feel free to get in contact with Ellen, and she'll be able to hopefully find you a seat on one of those training courses. It is well worth it. We ran a training course on an introduction to mining for parliamentarians and advisors a few months ago with the Critical Minerals Association, and the feedback that we've had from that training course has been fantastic. I think it, if nothing else, certainly sparked some discussion in the halls of Westminster and globally with regards to the civil service, which is absolutely fantastic. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'd just like to get into the course of proceedings for today. As I mentioned, this morning is jam-packed with absolutely phenomenal speakers. We're going to start off with the wonderful Alexander Stafford, MP, and I see that he has turned his video on. He's ready to go. So Alexander, I'm going to come to you in 2 seconds. So Alexander is going to be followed by the brilliant Francis Wall, and then off we will get trucking with the likes of Jeff Guy Pearl, Tim Laura, Michael Barron, Amanda Van Dyke, and a whole host of other fantastic speakers, all providing their insight as to what sort of tools, tips, tricks, techniques, and approaches can we use to make environment, social, and governance a reality with regards to raw materials, especially looking at this from a wide variety of perspectives, which is one of the reasons why we're starting off today by going to government. And it gives me massive pleasure to welcome Alexander Stafford to the stage. So Alexander, if you'd like to come off mute, because I will pass the stage across to yourself, invite you to give yourself your own fabulous introduction, and then get cracking with your talk. So Alexander, over to yourself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm great to be here today. For those that don't know, in the summation, I'm Alexander Stafford. I'm the Conservative Member of Parliament for Rother Valley, which is in South Yorkshire. I also sit on the BEIS, the Business, Energy, Industrial Strategy Select Committee. Prior to working, being elected to Parliament, I actually worked in the sort of environmental climate change space, first for WWF and then more latterly for Shell. So that is my sort of background knowledge. And I'm really pleased to be here today to bring a UK-focused policy-making perspective to this year's conference. And one of my roles in Parliament is as chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on ESG and the vice chair of the Critical Minerals All-Party Parliamentary Group, which really, this is a conference that exactly talks to me. I'm a strong supporter of the UK's role in responsible, sustainable critical minerals, mining and processing. It is in the area of green finance, environmental, social and governance that the UK is matchless, and these strengths will ensure the British critical minerals industry sets out the new gold standard for global mining. With COP26 in Glasgow and the G7 summit in Cornwall this year, Britain can and must take the lead on ESG responsible mining. The Western world's demand for critical minerals is set to soar as we ramp up our renewable energy generation. Our renewables and telecommunication technology of the future requires an ever-increasing amount of critical minerals. Without them, our society just cannot function. With global demand at this scale, shortages present a real threat to our economy and to our society. Now, certain autocratic regimes have proved themselves during the pandemic to be unreliable partners in terms of national security and human rights. These dictatorships control an alarming portion of the world's critical minerals mining and processing capacity. For instance, the People's Republic of China is a perfect example. More than 75% of the world's lithium-ion component manufacturers are located in China, resulting in more than 72% of lithium-ion batteries, and 45% of all global electric vehicles already being produced are in China. In December 2020, only a few months ago, the Chinese legislature passed a law on export control, allowing the Chinese government to ban exports of strategic minerals and advanced technology specific to foreign companies. And as a Chinese government spokesman said, China may take countermeasures against any country or region that abuses export control measures and poses a threat to China's national security and interests. And now this year alone, China has openly discussed the potential of cutting off the supply of rare earths or rare earth components to the United States. These are necessary for the US defense sector, and to put that in context, more than 400 kilograms of rare earths are needed for a single F-35 fighter. In other words, what I'm saying is China and other such countries have a stranglehold on the market of these minerals and resources we so need. But let me return to the example I often cite, which is during the coronavirus pandemic. Last year, the UK imported most of its personal protective equipment, PPE, from China, with only 1% of it made in the UK. When we needed it most, PPE, and at the height of the pandemic last March, April, China decided not to fulfill its obligations by either sending us defective PPE or not even sending us any at all. This obviously put a huge strain on the UK. Now, we manufacture 70% of PPE domestically. It is a very similar situation with critical minerals. When we take the attitude from China, pulling up the drawbridge when the time comes in their views, so unilaterally, along with actions over the likes of Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the treatment of Uyghurs, it is clear that we cannot and should not depend on the PRC for the future of our energy, economy, and defence sectors. What we need to do is pivot away from these sort of untrustworthy nations, those who are undemocratic, those we just can't rely on. And it's a chance for Britain, the Five Eyes, and the Commonwealth to control the narrative surrounding mining. If we do things our way, we can use our ESG toolbox to ensure that we fed exploitation upstream and create opportunities and prosperity for those in mining nations, alongside protecting our precious ecosystem. At the same time, by repatriating the midstream processing to Britain and also encouraging mining within the UK, we can increase our self-reliance and further control the ESG standards of the supply chain. I am a firm believer in a sort of positive mining culture pioneered by Britain and engaging each letter of the ESG acronym. A British mining trademark stamp must be the new industrial standard, to the extent that inferior operations in autocratic nations are pushed after the mainstream market. I strongly support the notion the UK is a force of good in the world. In stable partner nations such as Malawi, Tanzania, Zambia, the multiplier effect of responsibly run mining is somewhere between 10 and 25. In respect to Five Eyes, collaboration is vital for the mutual benefit of us all. We largely share the same economic and security objectives, and we face the same global threats. Close collaboration with our partner nations, especially Australia and Canada, will be vital to our upstream and overseas critical mining mineral supply. Japan, for instance, has already moved to increase its stockpile of rare earth minerals and has announced plans to aid domestic companies in obtaining stakes in overseas mines and processing facilities. The memory of the Chinese blockade on the export of critical minerals to Japan is still fresh in many Japanese policymakers' minds. In the United States, the Department of Defense has committed funding for 2 rare earth separation plants in the US to accompany its rare earth mine in Mountain Pass, California. The Australian government is similarly looking to build on its existing critical minerals expertise to reduce reliance on China as relations nosedive. There's also talk of diplomatic quad, consisting of Australia, India, Japan, and the United States, to collaborate in matters such as critical minerals. Britain must use its diplomatic prowess to coordinate a similar type of network in order to safeguard the West's ongoing access to rare earths and to protect our economies. Repatriating the critical mineral supply chain is a vital part of the government's levelling up agenda, upskilling the local population and supporting our green programme. The more steps in the chain located in the UK, the more we can control environmental standards, labour standards, and fundamentally ESG matters. Britain is world renowned for its strict mining regulations and close system of oversight. Our stellar reputation will be appreciated by those who work every stage of the supply chain, but also by our customers. It's clear to me that better ESG practices lead to a better product and in turn better profit margins for all involved. This ensures long-term business resilience for companies while safeguarding the UK's national security, aiding our net zero ambitions, creating jobs and wealth in every corner of Britain, and turbocharging UK PLC for our critical minerals exports of skills and rare metals. For all of this though to come true, we need the UK government to release an ambitious national critical mineral strategy, similar to Australia's recently released plans. The strategy must contain provision for creating a thriving upstream and midstream in Britain, commitments to work with overseas allies on a coordinated critical minerals network, and details on a common set of ESG metrics by which the British mining industry must comply. It is time for the UK government to take the global lead on responsible raw minerals and ESG mining and processing. We have the capacity and we have the political will to set the world leading standards and which will protect our environment, boost the companies and economy, and safeguard our national security. ESG metrics are the way forward not only in the business and finance sectors, but also for mining. We must ensure the industry respects the communities in which it works, takes proactive measures in related to corporate governance reform, and works to the highest environmental standards. The future of mining is British, and I look forward to hearing the thoughts of my fellow speakers on ESG and responsible mining in the United Kingdom. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Alexander. So, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for a round of applause from behind your muted microphones for the fantastic Alexander Stafford. That's really exciting and a true honour to have you here with us today. You mentioned the need for that, the national minerals strategy from the United Kingdom's perspective. Do you have any insight as to when this might be being produced or what the timeline is, etc., with regards to that?
If you'd asked me this time last year, I'd say the government wouldn't even be considering one. But things have changed dramatically in the last year, partly, as I mentioned, because of issues with China and similar countries, and it really focused minds, plus the sort of government's belief on Build Back Better. I think, I'm saying it's no coincidence, for instance, that I don't believe that we're having the G7 summit down in Cornwall, and Cornwall, obviously, as we all know, has large exports of lithium, which they're hoping to exploit. So I'm hopeful that'll be as soon as summer. But knowing governments, it probably will be pushed back to the end of this year. I mean, I think we're still waiting the hydrogen strategy, which is about a year and a half overdue now as it is. So I think we'll have to wait for a bit. But I do know in my conversation with the Australian High Commissioner, this is something they are pushing very, very, very hard for.
And with regards to that, Alexander, do you see that UK minerals strategy as incorporating both domestic mining, such as the extraction of lithium in Cornwall, but also the international trade and that influence of Britain on the world? What do you think the scope of that strategy might be?
I think it'd be both, frankly, because we need to demonstrate at home. First, we need to develop our own critical minerals resources hugely. So we need to have good, high quality standards. But where the UK really does play its own is its international prowess, and that is where those international standards come in. But so we can't do this alone. We have to work with our allies, the likes of Australia, with the US, with Japan, so we can actually put this across the globe. But we need to be able to use our soft power, which Britain is very good at, when it comes to these responsible minerals.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Alexander. And so, ladies and gentlemen, you may remember Victor Carrera's talk that he gave back on Tuesday, where he discussed the difference between soft power and hard power with regards to trying to shore up things like the different critical minerals, for example, we need for things like wind turbines, etc. So with regards to that, Alexander, do you see other avenues of strength within the UK really coming to bear here, such as the financial market, like the London Stock Exchange, and the fact that many international companies are, of course, listed in London that have something to do with raw materials? Do you see that being a part of this mineral strategy, or is that a little bit too far out of scope?
Whether it's part of the mineral strategy, I think it might be sort of pushing it. However, what is clear, and that's what going back to the sort of ESG side of thing, is that you can no longer look at things in isolation. You no longer look, we're doing this and that, and we have the financial markets to put pressure on mining companies and the buyers of the minerals and the processing to have good standards with environmental governance or whatever the standards are. And that way we can actually use that power that this is what we want to do. I think days, frankly, of cheap resource via China, via the DRC with poor standards are over almost. I think there's almost now built in that if we want to have a green future, you mentioned the wind farms, which we all do, and the government is very much pushing, we can't be hypocrites. We can't just say in the UK we'll have nice green materials, nice green resources, if we're pushing our problems elsewhere. And I think with COP at the end of this year, that is really going to focus the market. The government does want to make COP an absolutely huge moment in time, and we need to show that we are leading the way on this.
So with that as well, I mean, obviously there's been huge change over the past couple of years. Yes, we've had COVID doing something to all of us, but also Brexit as well. There are a number of questions that are coming in here saying, obviously, when we were part of Europe, actually, a lot of thought had been going into that European mineral strategy for many, many years. Are we taking a lot of that learning with us at the moment, or do we see actually Brexit giving the United Kingdom an ability to think perhaps a bit more freely? How do you see Brexit impacting on this?
I think it's a mixture of both, the positive and negatives. And the first negative I want to say is we are now, obviously, Europe, EU, our friends and allies, but we're also competing against them. And as I mentioned, that we need critical minerals for whether it's defence, whether it's for our environmental projects, our wind turbine energy, but so does the EU. So we are all buying generally from the same pot. We are still buying from the likes of China, and so we are frankly in competition with them. And in itself, that presents a challenge, but also an opportunity for us to differentiate our buying price. So we will only buy from better companies, we better resource, so we can set ourselves apart from that. And frankly, because we are out of the EU, we can actually make those deals quickly and more efficiently. And when we're negotiating, for instance, with Australia, and I hope we have a good free trade agreement with Australia, we can be more fleet of foot. We don't need to rely on 26, 27 other countries to make that deal. We can get that deal done quickly and also steal a march in the European Union. So they are friends, but we are buying from the same pot. But because we are out of the Union, I think we can take advantage of those quick opportunities. And I think that is quite important, especially when we're discovering new seams of material and new areas. If we get our act together, it can be a big advantage.
Thank you for that. So with that, so I know that we've got many geologists on the line. I'm speaking personally originally as an exploration geologist as well. And there's a question here from Nick Arndt, and he asks, is part of the solution to greatly increase domestic mining of rare earth elements in the UK, but then also going beyond into, say, Greenland, Europe, etc. as well? Do you see that as being part of the solution?
Oh yeah, we definitely need to exploit as much of our natural resources when it comes to critical minerals as we have in the UK. But we've also got to be realistic. There just clearly aren't enough. By any estimations, we just do not have enough lithium. There's stuff in Cornwall, there's stuff in Northern Ireland, there's various places, and we should utilise as much as possible. We have a fraction of what we currently need, yet alone what we're going to need. So we have to look at other markets. Greenland is a very case in point. And it goes back to what I was saying, is at the moment we were too reliant on countries, frankly, we can't trust. Either because we can't trust them because they're China, they're having bad standards. Countries like Greenland, obviously Denmark, they're EU country, they're democracy, they have good human rights records. We should be working with countries like Greenland because we all need the materials. The question is where they come from, how they're used. We need to try and develop those and buy basically from those countries the better standards, which will also hopefully increase standards in other countries. And say if we want to sell our materials to the likes of the UK or other Five Eyes, we need to improve our labour records, our environmental records. So we need to basically try and exploit as many new avenues as we can. But you cannot be in a situation like we were with PPE last year, where we rely on one country, which frankly we couldn't trust and turned out not to be trustworthy. And I mentioned China, but that wasn't the only country, frankly, we had difficulty with PPE. Turkey was another one, which sent us a lot of poor quality stuff. And when push comes to shove, every country is naturally going to look after themselves. But in a democracy, when you have good legal processes, trade needs to flow, and that's very important.
With that, Alexander, so you're mentioning, there are countries that we can't necessarily trust, and that might be for a number of different reasons. But of course, as we know, the vast majority of cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Where do you think our responsibility as a nation goes in terms of actually supporting the governments, etc., in those nations to ensure that they do actually improve their levels of responsibility, as it were, or trustworthiness? Because every single one of us, I suspect, has a phone in our pocket, which most likely has cobalt that has come from the DRC. How do you see that in terms of our being able to influence those governments that may at the moment be on the untrustworthy list?
Oh, absolutely huge. It's important. Go back to talking about sort of soft power is absolutely essential. We do that, but it's not just the countries, it's also the companies. There's a big obviously class action suit at the moment, the tech companies, exactly about child slavery and the like. So if you can't even trust the likes of Amazon and Google and Apple, that is a problem. So we need to put leverage on the big companies as well, on their tax regime, to say you can only buy minerals for your phones, etc., which have good standards. So we need to use that diplomatic aspect. And this goes back a bit to what I think is very much UK's place in the world. We are still, whatever you say, we're still one of the global powers, and our soft power and all the soft power metrics are always number one and number two when it comes to exerting our soft power. And we need to use that as a force for good. And it goes back to when we're talking about international development and DFID. So that's one type of power, obviously aid, very important to use aid to encourage regimes to treat people better, frankly. But there's many other ways that we can also exert influence. And frankly, what with us leaving the European Union, because we have the abilities to make or break trade agreements, individual countries, frankly, need, if they want a trade deal with the UK, they should have good human rights records, they should have labour records, they should have good environmental records. And we're in a position now to, frankly, walk away from some countries. I'm not saying we should, but we can, and where we say we don't want to trade with you, which we couldn't have before. So in fact, we can actually have that more leverage, because we couldn't say that if we're part of the EU.
So with that as well, Alexander, so you mentioned obviously there's been lots of discussion with the likes of Australia and learning from them in terms of their mineral strategy. There are quite a few questions coming in along the lines of, are we in competition with the likes of Australia, Canada, etc.? Or do we think that rather than having a United Kingdom mineral strategy, should it be a Commonwealth mineral strategy that we try and go for?
I mean, I think ideally, in a perfect world, we would be working on a Commonwealth strategy. I think we have to be a bit realistic. I'm a great fan of the Commonwealth. I think it's a great sort of friendship group, but it's not the most effective when it comes to trading and that side of group. Maybe it will in the future post leaving the EU. We don't know, but we are in some competition, but it's a healthy competition, and that's why we're not going to compete with Australia with the likes of mining. We're just not. However, when it comes to processing, because the vast majority of minerals which start from Australia are sent to China for processing and then sent back to Australia. If we can be that, the midstream, we can do the processing in best standards, then we can have a far better relationship when it comes to critical minerals. So we need to find our place in the market. I very much think the UK's place to shine is that processing side rather than the mining side, although we need to develop our own mining capacities.
Thank you for that, Alexander. One final question, if I may, and then we will release you back to your other incredibly important duties. And this actually comes from our next speaker, so Frances Wall, and she asks, you mentioned that repatriating the supply chain, of course, is a part of government levelling up agenda. Could you tell us how this is translating or is likely to translate into action?
Basically, we're looking back to my seat in the north of England, a classic seat called Red Wall seat, which people want to level up. Lack of jobs, but it's a highly skilled workforce still. My seat had 6 collieries in when they're operating. It's a high manufacturing level. We have the skills, the technical skills in the north of England, and if we want to move some of the more jobs out of London and the southeast, we need to find new avenues to develop them. And one thing which is slightly different is there's a big hydrogen plant in just on the border of my constituency, just outside, and that's obviously we're looking at hydrogen home heating, hydrogen vehicles. Suddenly we're using the green revolution to create new jobs, and the same can be applied to the critical minerals processing. If we develop the plants in these former industrial areas that have the skill base there, the links there, and we can actually bring the jobs back to these areas. There's no point just putting all these processing plants down in London and the southeast. Frankly, we probably don't want them there anyway. We actually want them here. We can actually have the workforce and the skilled workforce to do those jobs.
So one final question, my apologies, just to sneak it in there. You mentioned COP26, which of course is a phenomenal opportunity for the country as a whole. Given that we've got a very wide community of individuals who work within raw materials, not just within the UK, but globally, what can we be doing to support the government and the organising committee with regards to COP26? Is there anything that we can do to support it?
You say support it, I say put pressure on it. Basically said, if you took this conversation last year, nobody was talking about critical minerals in the government. I mean, the fact that I held the first debate in Parliament on critical minerals about 2 months ago says it all, that it wasn't really being talked about, but things have changed dramatically, and it is people's inboxes. So every time I'm sure lots of people speak to various select committee or party groups, it's important just to talk about that. And we also need to make sure it's not just seen as an environmental issue, because it's obviously important. But I mentioned the F-35 fighter to emphasise the government that critical minerals, rare earths, go in everything. We need them to survive. We need them for our national defence. We need them for the NHS. And it's trying to have that level of conversation. But I think too much of the conversation is talking about wind turbines, very important, but that's not it's all about. And I think often the green movement, I call myself a greenie or whatever, gets pigeonholed in a certain way, and that does turn off a lot of people in government and civil servants. We need to actually, these are just essential for the future of society, and that is how we get the message across and how to focus the minds.
Great, thank you very much for that, Alexander. So essential for the future of society. That is a soundbite we will all be taking away. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the fantastic Alexander Stafford, Member of Parliament. Thank you very much, Alexander. Brilliant.
Thank you for having me.
Fantastic. We are now going to move from Parliament to Cornwall. So we heard Cornwall already being mentioned, to the lovely Professor Frances Wall. Frances and I, we've known one another for many, many years. And Frances is in the vanguard, shall we say, with regards to getting the circular economy to be a reality, not just within the UK, but globally as well. So I know that Frances is there beginning to share her slides. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the phenomenal Professor Frances Wall. Thank you very much.
Good morning, and thank you very much for having me this morning, Sarah. It's a great pleasure to be here and to listen to Alexander Stafford with that first talk, which is revolutionary, if I may say so. He's absolutely right compared with what might have been said. Well, nobody would have been here last year, were they? Or I don't think at a conference like this. And so I think you've put me in this slot here probably to follow on from what's just been said, noting the UK government interest. And I'm going to introduce you to a new research centre that we have called Met4Tech, which comes out of DEFRA, so particular environmental interests there, pudding, if you like, or lobbying with the UK Research and Innovation in the UK about a circular economy initiative. And we were fortunate enough to win one of those projects, which is a new centre called Met4Tech. And so I'm here this morning on behalf of all of my colleagues in that centre, which, as I'll show you in a minute, is lots of us. So it's a pleasure to be able to tell you a little bit about this initiative, which, as I said, is a major UK initiative. It's got 5 centres, 5 new centres, and a coordinating hub. It's called the National Interdisciplinary Circular Economy Research Programme, or NICER for short, and it's a £30 million investment in circular economy research. And if you read the titles against the pretty colour spots there, you'll see that there are new centres. We all started in January, one looking at textiles, one looking at chemicals, and then 3 actually that relate to the topic of the Responsible Raw Materials Workshop, one on construction minerals, on metals, and ours, Met4Tech, on technology metals. Okay. And why then is this in the UK? What's the interest? Well, although we've just been warned not to go completely down the rabbit hole of environmental in talking about the importance of raw materials, I think this programme definitely come out of the climate challenge. And this is a slide from the hub coordinators, and they explain that overall in the UK, we're requiring 1.2 billion tonnes of materials to sustain our economy. And although in terms of climate change, we're often concentrating on energy and the energy mix, in fact, that's 55% of our current emissions, and the other 45% is on products. So thinking about things is absolutely an important part of the climate change agenda. And so that's where we come in then. I think thinking about things, especially things that will generate the clean energy for climate change. That's how we manage to get our technology metals into the mix. We mean by technology metals things on that list. So we do absolutely mean critical raw materials. We optimistically said technology metals because we'd like things not to be critical, of course. That's the point of what we're doing in our research. And we are concentrating on those specialist metals. We can't do all of them, of course. We're not that big research centre. So like everybody else, we are already chasing electric vehicles and wind turbines and solar panels, things that are at the top of the UK and really worldwide agenda just right at the moment is securing those raw materials. So I put the logos of all the group involved, so you can see it's not just Camborne School of Mine, Exeter, it's my business school colleagues at Exeter, Manchester University, Social Science, Leicester Chemists and Geologists, Birmingham, the Materials, People, Recycling and Law, and then the British Geological Survey. If you could just hold the idea that the centre's in 4 themes, and so we first of all have to sort out where our technology metals are. So that's our theme 1, looking at stocks and flows and practices and all along the value chain, and looking at the environmental footprint as well as the economics of that. And we pull theme 1 together with 2 other themes, come to in a second, and we'll be aiming to make a roadmap for a technology metals circular economy system centred around the UK. So this is interesting because normally I'm working very internationally, but for this one, we certainly have international collaboration, but the end focus of our roadmap has to be on what's happening in the UK. So all of our themes have interdisciplinary research, but we have two quite distinct, more technical ones, if you like. One is about design and manufacturing cycling technologies, which you would expect in a circular economy project. But the other one, we are the only one of the 5 centres in this programme, is looking at raw materials and geomodels. And I think that we managed to justify putting this into our centre because it's really the need for lithium, cobalt and rare earths for clean technologies that's brought the fact that we really need more raw materials, and mining is absolutely part of the to the fore. So often when we think circular economy, we're always starting in the middle and looking what will happen to products, but with this new energy transition and the materials for that, it's made us turn around and, even if I may say so, the UK government look at where things are coming from. So I think that that has actually been a key and a bit of a revolution that now enables us to put our research into the circular economy agenda. So what's coming now is just a few thoughts then on where we are with mining and primary materials in thinking about circular economy research. And so first then, let me show you this Ellen MacArthur butterfly, very popular circular economy diagram. It's one that I quite like, but I'll leave you looking at the right-hand side in the butterfly and see if you can find mining on there. And of course, as so often, we're right up the top, see the little red truck there. So we're almost not really part of the solution. This is where things come from, and it's called finite materials. I don't know if that's a warning or a negative or what, and then they feed into this circular economy. And of course, the aim of this, why it's done like this, is to keep the circles as small as possible and the value as high as possible, and eventually to capture things at end of life and recycle. So I think one of our challenges then in thinking about primary raw materials is to integrate ourselves. So we're not just floating off the end of these diagrams, and that we're really integrated nicely into circular economy thinking. And so that's what we're able to do in Met4Tech then, is bring ourselves together. We have this big array of people, and you might be looking to see if there's any faces on there that you recognize, and it's quite likely you will. But this is a big mixture of cycle assessment specialists, geologists, lawyers, social scientists, engineers, material scientists. And I think that's the most important thing in the first few months, is enjoying working together and trying to have these conversations and learn each other's languages. And here's some of the things that I can pick out already then. So we have thematic area 1, remember that stocks, flows and practices. This is being led by Evi Petavrazzi at British Geological Survey and Marcus Seals in the Business School at Exeter. Now, I'm sure that Evi made this slide, and I know that absolutely because she's got that very nice little circular economy diagram from the EIT KIC for raw materials. And if I go to the next slide, then we love this, don't we, in mining, because from seeing all virtuous, green, idyllic circles that can never quite be true with nothing in production of primary raw materials on, we get a bit fed up about that. And the EIT fought back with this pretty diagram. We're going to have to not use this diagram in Met4Tech because our business colleagues fight back, and they hate the fact that in that, well, they don't hate, they're very polite, they do hate that in that blue circle is all the reuse and reuse. So all those small cells on the Ellen MacArthur diagram, the way to keep the highest value and the thing we really need, these business models in circular economy, is in this tiny little section. So this is our techie circular economy view, but we need something in between the different sorts of views to represent raw materials. So watch this space, see if we come up with something better from Met4Tech then. So staying with Ellen MacArthur then, I thought I'd put up this very nice, simple definition of circular economy. They say 3 things, this is straight off their website: designing out waste and pollution, keeping products and materials in use, and regenerating natural systems. Okay, and of course we're on that right-hand side on the materials part of circular economy. So how does that apply to mining? Well, of course, straight away, designing out waste and pollution, that's really easy, isn't it? We're doing that all the time, not just in going and reusing waste or thinking up even things to do with waste, but I think even when we're thinking geology and geometallurgy and designing mines, of course, the types of geology and the ore affects how much we get out, what our efficiency in processing is, the energy use, carbon, water use, environment, etc. And so much of what we're doing in responsible sourcing and responsible mining is speaking straight to that main part of the definition of circular economy. So it's really easy then to put a lot of what we're doing already into a circular economy context, and much wider than you might think at first. And how about keeping products and materials in use? Well, I want to use this diagram. I hope it's not too complicated to show that. So I think when we're talking about ESG toolkits and responsible mining, we're often thinking about what I've put in this number one circle here is how a mine behaves, what it produces for all its different stakeholders, how it benefits the company, that kind of service to human and infrastructure capital and longevity after the mine has even closed, terms of sustainable development. And that's one view of sustainable mining. And often people think that's a bit negative because the mine will close, of course. But if you take the other view, is thinking about what materials are mined. When we're mining metals, they are really super sustainable materials, aren't they? Once that copper, once that neodymium is out of the ground, it's not going to disappear so long as we look after it. And I see that you have got material stewardship on the ESG infographic. Thank you very much, Sarah. As long as we look after it, it will keep going round and round those circles on the Ellen MacArthur butterfly diagram, and we can keep it at higher value and eventually catch it, recycle it. And that view of sustainability, I think, is really important to integrate into our ESG toolbox thinking as well as we can, and think about how miners are really stewards of the metals, of these brilliantly sustainable materials that are produced. And regenerating natural systems, well, maybe this isn't what MacArthur was thinking about when that was written, but of course we do that, don't we, in mining? And I put these lovely pictures from B2 Gold where they have a whole rewilding scheme around the mine, and thinking about that in a big way. So looking after our natural environment and making sure that it's well looked after as possible whilst mining, and looked after nicely after mining, is really important part of what people are thinking of in responsible mining already. So it can fit that one too. And what are we doing then in Metfotech in our thematic area too? Then we're taking those ideas and we have some case studies, and we're starting right in Cornwall, which is the topical area for this morning. My colleague's Karen Hudson-Edwards, and who's a geologist and a specialist in mine waste geochemistry, and our lawyers, Bob and Alex, and a group of us with postdoc Eva Marcus, who some people may know, who's joined us. We are going to be looking at what should a geomodel be, looking at the whole circular economy ecosystem of an area like Cornwall, and what's the best way to tackle this from a circular economy point of view. Our exploration projects for lithium and tin and tungsten come online. So we're starting this, but it's very exciting. And then just quickly to pick on thematic area 3, which was other techie one, thinking about design for manufacturing and recycling. But if you look at this slide from Andy Pitt and Alan Walton, you'll see that the chemists, the material scientists are using keywords that we know, like pyrometallurgy and hydrometallurgy, and absolutely they're working on processing primary ores at Leicester, and also the recycling as well. So these sit very closely together. And you might think, well, I know that already, but I think one thing we've learned as well is what skills we have even as geologists that will transfer into thinking about secondary raw materials, and codes. The UN framework classification are already being applied to recycling and anthropogenic sources. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to take our resource skills into that secondary raw materials environment there. So that really is a great opportunity to join up. And in Metfotech, we'll be trying to join all these things up in our thematic area 4, doing agent-based computer modeling to make our roadmap. And we have 3.5 years, more or less, in order to do that. So conclusions then, I think loads of opportunity for integrating primary raw materials in circular economy. The principles absolutely apply right to mining, right from the first stage of exploration geology, and can be part of our ESG toolkit. Joining up value chain is key, and that's not easy. We have to move out of our comfort zones to talk to different people. So your bubble was very excellent. You're bursting the bubble, excellent session there. And of course, we can apply the lessons that we know into secondary raw materials. So lots to do. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much, Frances. So ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the wonderful Frances Wall. Brilliant. Frances, just a couple of questions, if we may. And ladies and gentlemen, please do post your questions into either chat, the Q&A, or if you're watching on YouTube, pop them into the chat there and we'll be able to pull them across. Frances, you mentioned that so the fantastic EIT materials circular economy diagrams, the one that looks a little bit like a turbo or something like that, and the fact that the business experts didn't like it because they didn't feel that it was detailed enough, perhaps on one of the little bits. Where do you think, I guess, we've been going wrong? Because I think that's been a really good diagram, I guess, from the mining perspective. Is that just us not seeing the perspectives of others and therefore incorporating it into the diagrammatic representations?
Yes, absolutely. I think that was a fight back diagram. That's why I really liked it, because before that we'd seen everybody putting up this circle, which was just a complete circle saying, which always implies that the aim of circular economy is to get rid of mining. It's like what we want. We don't want this nasty stuff. We want this perfect circle that just keeps sending the materials round and round. And I think, of course, the EIE raw materials was all about the technical, or is all about the technical raw materials side of it. And so that's their technical diagram. And maybe they're certainly in starting, they were less about the business models. But when you come from the business school, all about the business model. So your whole life is thinking about business to business, consumer to business, etc. models, and you think less about the technical. So showing different perspectives, isn't it? That point of view, saying that field's much too small, is just putting together the different points of view. So we're trying to design one that'll suit everybody. That's a challenge of what we do in the centre. Yeah, so it's all about perspectives. It's the answer, really.
Yeah, I think this makes a really interesting point, because as we just heard from Alexander, this time last year, nobody in government was talking about raw materials at all. Yet we've all been talking about raw materials probably for our entire lives. And so almost perhaps the challenge is being able to convey what is actually important rather than all the detail that's like our favorite detail. Do you think that there's like a bit of a balancing act in terms of that communication to people such as politicians, etc., around, well, what do we actually need to tell them rather than drowning them in detail? What do you think?
Yes, I think it's very difficult, especially in critical raw materials, to make a clear message. And I have to say, Alexander's still on the call. I thought I did a pretty good job this morning in drawing out some of the different aspects. Because one moment we're talking about, let's, get some new mines going in Britain, but then, and on another material, well, that might be right for, say, lithium, and we've got tin and tungsten deposits, and maybe even copper and so on. But then on another side, on rare earths, we'll be saying, well, we've got to go abroad and do that. And so these are all, and then we'll be talking about processing. And I see someone put a question in the chat about, well, hang a minute, do we want to do the processing in UK, or won't other countries want to do the processing and gain that part of the value chain, which of course they will. But what processing then? I'd be right up, there's a difference between minerals processing on the site, between the original refining, between making the next stage of the product. So this is all quite complicated, isn't it? And I think you have to be able to distill the messages without losing the technical correctness. But that's an important role for us, isn't it? Is to go to the policy discussions. And sometimes I find myself doing this, and I'm not the professional policy maker, the politician, but I can say, oh yes, but when you process a rare earth deposit, or these are the different types of lithium deposits, and so you're conflating a SAR with a pegmatite or something, and you need to think about the different ways they're processed and the challenges. So we can really help with that, with the technical detail, but we need to be prepared to make that really clear not expect everybody. I think they're, narners if they don't know the technical detail like we do, because they're experts in different areas, of course, where we're the narners.
And I guess with that, so unfortunately Alexander has just dropped off, so he's going to miss this bombshell of an idea, which is when we're trying to find those really good points within the broader raw materials space. So say, for example, if you're trying to look for the business case of the United Kingdom, and bearing in mind this is a global conference, we're not just British people talking to one another. It's actually saying, well, actually, where could the competitive advantage be for the UK? Because let's face it, the next big copper mine is not going to be in the UK because we do not have the rocks. And of course, that's something that people perhaps don't necessarily understand, is we're not going to have a massive domestic mining industry, but actually where we can influence that raw material space maybe in other angles, such as processing, for example, but we need to be able to do that in the right way. And I guess that's some of the messaging that's coming through. Is that a correct interpretation, Francis?
Yeah, yes. And remember that messaging is not just for primary raw materials, it's for secondary raw materials as well. So when we talk about recycling, people sort of assume that will be in the UK until you go and talk to specialists who point out that for some of these, especially for specialist metals, we've got nowhere near enough in the UK to make it worthwhile recycling. And we really need to be teamed up with partners, including, dare I say, in Europe, which is, often close by places to collect these things. So both of, again, the principles are very similar. There are some things we can do in the UK well and should, and there are other things where we definitely need to have international partnerships to make those work best. And I think, again, that's where our technical expertise come in, and that's why we need 4 years to roadmap for the UK to work out how the UK fits into that international environment. So I think that's a bit of a challenge. I'm used to working on rare earths actually, and so I'm really used to always be thinking internationally and working abroad and thinking of deposits abroad. And here we have to centre this Met for Tech set on, research on the UK, but absolutely that is in an international context, both from the point of view of best practice and collaborators from abroad, but very much from looking at how the value chains work, and many of those will of course be very much in an international context, linking with partners abroad. And we have to work out what can be done in the UK and what really should be on our roadmap with international partnerships.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Francis. And if people are interested in a lot of this, I refer you back to Andrew Buchanan's short spiel yesterday from the Mineral Processing Institute, where there's lots of research going on into things like recycling and design of batteries, etc., as well. So, Francis, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for the wonderful Professor Francis Wall. Thank you very much, Francis.
Thank you very much.
Great. So we're going to move swiftly on to an equally as fabulous and fantastic Jeff Geipel, who we were on a panel not that long ago, actually a few weeks ago, weren't we, Jeff, with Edgermine. And Jeff brings with him phenomenal insight into the procurement of these raw materials. So we've spoken this morning about government and government strategy from one country's perspective. And we've then taken a look at some of the research that's going on into that broad circular economy space. And now we're going to look at, okay, so what goes on in the world of procurement, and people saying, okay, where do we actually buy these materials from? So Jeff, without further ado, I pass across to your wonderful self.
Great, thank you very much. Let me just get my slides up. Thank you very much for the opportunity. It's exciting that you put all this together. There's so much going on. How do I get my? Sorry, I just can't see. I can't click on the. There we go. Okay. Well, thanks again. So my name is Jeff Geipel. I'm with the Mining Shared Value Initiative of Engineers Without Borders Canada, though I live in the UK actually. We're a nonprofit initiative focused on helping and pushing the mining sector to increase local procurement of goods and services where they operate. So there's our social media links. We're a nonprofit convener and advocate think that we're trying to help all the global mining system and in individual countries increase local procurement. And that's because local procurement is the biggest economic lever, or potential one, I should say, in terms of creating economic development. And that also has giant implications for social license to operate and ESG. So this is just a stat which I think is really amazing, and to be honest, hasn't, we need more of these stats, and this hasn't been sort of made in a while. This is from the World Gold Council. This is looking at all their in-country spending by their member companies in 2013, which is the last time they put this together. And you can see that 71% of all in-country payments actually go to procurement from goods and service providers. So, we're spending a lot of time when it comes to ESG and transparency and taxation. Debates, we're really focusing on the taxation and some of the other risks, but procurement really is the biggest potential lever for economic development, and that obviously means it's a big lever for social license to operate. And so obviously people who are logged in today know this kind of stat, but this is the third year in a row that the EY survey of company executives found that social license to operate was the #1 risk for the mining sector. So again, this is critical right now more than ever. And then when we were speaking about procurement of the services, the coronavirus hit, and this is just a indicative image of what the world woke up to in terms of how reliant everybody was on imports from around the world, and the mining sector was no different. Many mining companies were cut off from goods and service providers, particularly service providers, obviously, because if they were international firms, they couldn't travel to a country like Ghana or Kenya for that matter. So this has really caused a re-envisioning of supply chains and the recognition of the value of having local suppliers in countries. So on top of that, the other kind of push factor in terms of why procurement is a huge issue that companies should get right, and stakeholders who work with mining companies should work with them to get right, is that it's being regulated. So we've got new laws in several African countries in the last sort of 3 or 4 years that require local procurement by the companies. Right now, there's a few other countries in the process. Senegal right now is working on finalizing their regulations, so is Zambia. And while this was originally a very Africa-focused phenomenon, we are now seeing local content requirements being placed in Latin America as well, and Saudi Arabia is another example. So this is really a global movement. And then any company who operates in Canada or Australia will know about the requirements for community development agreements. They have different names in different countries, but CDAs generally. And of course, this means that you must have agreements with local indigenous communities, and local procurement is always part of those requirements. So again, these are a paradigm shift in terms of regulation. And we are seeing now governments realize they need to also match these requirements with supplier development. So you have seen quite a number of new supplier development initiatives from governments in Chile and Tanzania, as just a couple examples. So what I want to offer today in terms of a tool and how we can manage this better is basically measurement. It seems fairly obvious that we need more measurement of this issue, local procurement, like any other issue. But the reality is that despite a whole decade of regulations and increased attention on this issue, we don't actually have much in the way of public measurement systems. The local procurement is not a part of the EITI standard, even though it's very important to know that many countries are starting to request this anyways as part of sort of voluntary agreements between companies. And as I alluded to, all those mining countries, they've got new regulations, but you don't see what actually happened. There's no yearly report showing how local procurement by the mining sector has increased or decreased in the years following those regulations. So we haven't really got to the place yet where we have a real good measurement system, aside from a few individual cases. And that's a big problem, because we don't, you can't manage what you don't measure, right? That's an obvious point. Likewise, community development agreements mostly remain confidential, so we don't see the results in those situations. And all of this is leading to the fact that the companies are in fact missing the mark on local procurement. And this is, one, it's causing social license problems, and two, it's leading to further government regulation. If the companies do not succeed at local procurement initiatives, they know they will get regulated in many of these cases. And again, when it comes to the power of reporting and measurement, and we know this because we look at the safety example. Health and safety is an example where there's been a drastic improvement of numbers and reduced injuries and deaths, and that's largely in a context in many cases where it's really a voluntary situation, right? If you're in many countries, yes, it doesn't help your reputation, but the reality is, sadly, that there isn't actually a real legal consequence in many countries for health and safety problems. And so, yet despite that, with the sort of omnipresent health and safety reporting and measurement, and we have seen an improvement across the sector. So we do know that measurement and voluntary reporting work. That leads us to the tool that we're kind of here to present today, which is a fully free and publicly available tool, which we created with GIZ, the German Development Agency. It's called the Mining and Local Procurement Reporting Mechanism, or LPRM. And it's available in French and Spanish. The French acronym and hashtag is MRL. And what we're here is to offer, essentially a set of disclosures that we want the mining sectors to use to talk about local procurement. It's really just a set of practical information on local procurement practices and results that we hope all mine sites will provide, again, to improve their own practices, but also to empower host country suppliers and stakeholders. And so here's a few examples that just sort of the kind of policy that a mining company has on local procurement, who's accountable for local procurement, how are major contractors like EPCM service providers incentivized. So we're really just trying to get the information out there. Here's an example of a company using it. We've now got four companies who've officially adopted the LPRM and have come out with the reports, and we've got two more about to. So we actually hope to hit about eight companies using this by the end of the year. This is Lundin Gold in Ecuador. You can see they are reporting all their local procurement spending, where it's going, and that's really exciting. It's helping them manage things better. It's also helping inform better policies. So that's just an example. And then you can see here they've kind of created an index very similar to the Global Reporting Initiative in the report. What we really want to do is get to the point where mining companies are providing this really practical information on supplier development. Now Freeport, the American company, is not using the LPM quite. They're almost there, but this is a really great example of the kind of public information they have on their supplier practices, their supplier code of conduct. And I think companies should look at following this lead, because if companies do not have this kind of information publicly available, it just leads to resentment and conflict. And frankly, if there's no information, the vacuum is filled by allegations of corruption and favoritism and that kind of thing. So we're trying to help the sector get better on that one. So again, in terms of trying to help everybody manage this issue better, we're trying to get the information out there to help that. And the other angle, which I kind of finished with, is this ESG pressure, and why you should care about local procurement as an issue, and procurement in general is we are seeing huge pressure on supplier due diligence around the world, and it's coming from regulation, it's coming from high profile incidents. So a Canadian company that has now since been bought by a Chinese company was sued in Canadian court, and actually went all the way to the Supreme Court, and it was going to be heard in Canadian court, which is the first time that's pretty much happened. And it's because they had bought labor from a construction services provider in Eritrea that was linked to the military, and there was forced labor. So you can end up in court essentially for your supplier's actions. So we are seeing a big focus on this. World Gold Council now has a public supply chain policy requirement for their responsible gold mining principles. So again, we are seeing pressure for companies to provide information on how they manage this risk. And likewise, the ESG ratings agencies, who score you and affect your capital access? These are the kind of questions they're asking now. They are asking companies about vendor codes of conduct and sort of how you manage supplier due diligence. So, our message is you might as well get ahead of this, because the ESG rating agencies and investors are asking about what you're doing on procurement to ensure you're not purchasing from problematic suppliers. So lastly, just a little resource. We've made a brief that shows you sort of how local procurement is covered in all the various other standards like the GRI, responsible gold mining principles, the ICMM's performance expectations. And so I can provide a link in the chat to that after. And I'll just lead before we get to the questions that, the pressure on the mining sector to increase local procurement is not going away. So I suppose, it's something that mining companies can complain about, but it's not going away. So why not try to create some business value out of it? Why not try to get more access to capital by increasing your reporting? And this is the largest economic impact. Let's get it right. And lastly, I'll say that we have so many initiatives going on, government regulations and standards. So we're trying to help everybody align on this issue. So I'll leave it there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jeff. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the wonderful Jeff Geipel. Fantastic. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jeff. So with this, and actually kind of building on the conversation we were just having with Francis, Jeff, what's your background?
My background, I'm actually work for Engineers Without Borders, but I'm not smart enough to be an engineer. I'm a policy guy. So I did my background in international development, international trade, political economy, that kind of thing.
Fantastic, because the reason I ask is, of course, this conference seems to have been dominated by geoscientists, and it's almost a problem because we realise we all see the world from a very similar perspective. So with regards to all of this, and I know that actually Tim and Michael's talk that's just coming up next is going to complement what you've just said incredibly well, because they're talking about beneficial ownership. With regards to this, one of the common questions that I certainly get is, if you are, say, for example, you are a cobalt and copper mining company in the DRC, you're being bombarded by questionnaires, audits, etc. on ESG from your customers, investors, other random NGOs, etc. the entire time. What can we be doing to try and align some of that? And I ask that with the twist that, of course, the reason for a procurement specialist asking for information, the purpose of that is different to, say, an investor. Mm-hmm. So asking questions from different directions. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say put it on paper. I mean, this is why we get frustrated sometimes, because mining companies kind of complain about the reporting burden, but it's only a burden if you don't manage it well. If you do a really great job, for example, by using the LPRM on procurement, you write it all down, you have this great reporting system done, you have your website updated, and then every ESG ratings question, you say, look at the website. I mean, rather than fill out questionnaires one by one, and ad hoc, why not do it all at once? And I guess what we've been saying is we've mapped out all the standards that are used by the mining sector. So essentially, if you use the LPRM, you'll be providing all the information that is requested by everybody, from governments to ESG rating agencies to standards like IRMA or the RGMPs. So it makes sense to just sort of do some homework, get everything done on paper for the first time, and then it'll save time in the long run. So we would say that for the LPRM, but I mean, I would imagine you'd have a very similar dynamic across many issues, right? It's putting some upfront work will save a lot more time down the road anyways.
Brilliant, thanks for that. And I mean, the other thing as well is, of course, it's almost the impetus to go ahead and do a lot of this in part comes from government regulation. So say, for example, in the UK in the Modern Human Slavery Act, which then, of course, 3 years ago in Australia, it then went in there. So you're beginning to see this cascade effect. Do you see most companies only doing this when they absolutely have to? With one or two kind of getting ahead of the curve, or do you think that wave of momentum is now here and actually more companies are saying, you know what, it's coming, we may as well get it done now?
I mean, look, I think all things being equal, pressure drives performance, right? And there are exceptions. I mean, there are exceptions where there are some really great companies who kind of get out ahead of every issue, but generally speaking, it's pressure. And it just depends on what time or what time and what type. So, I mean, look, in some countries, if you're working in the Congo or Eritrea, yes, the pressure is going to be on the ESG, the risk mitigation angle. Are you buying from suppliers with child labor? That's going to be the pressure point. And you'll see a little more focus on things like supplier due diligence. If you, however, are operating in Canada or Australia and the focus is on economic development, the pressure is actually going to be on, demonstrating your economic value created for local communities. And so there's kind of a case in Canada right now with Baffinland iron mines, and they had an agreement with the local Inuit organization, and they had targets that they didn't meet, and they made a public report showing that they didn't meet local hiring targets, local procurement targets, and now they're kind of upping they're redoing the agreement, or they have redone the agreement and working on things. So in that case, that's the pressure that pushed them to do this better. So it really depends on the context. I mean, I'll give a shout out to a few companies in Golden Star Resources, which uses the LPRM and is a Canadian company kind of moving to Britain, headquarters wise. I mean, they're way out ahead of the game, and they see the value in this, even though, I mean, yes, there is pressure in Ghana, but they're doing it anyways. Anglo American has done a great job. Lundin Gold has. I mean, there's many companies who are going out ahead, even regardless of their level of pressure. But yes, I mean, it's fair to say pressure plays a huge role.
Brilliant. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for a warm thank you very much to Jeff. Thank you, Jeff. Brilliant.
Thank you.
So following on with that vein of thought from procurement into beneficial ownership, and you saw Jeff referencing this a little bit on the way through his slides. So Tim and Michael, I don't know if you guys are sharing slides, if you want to go for it now and find those mute buttons. Jeff mentioned Anglo-American just there. Well, Tim and myself, we met whilst working inside Anglo-American. So we've got to give that a shout out, don't we, Tim? And Tim and Michael are a phenomenal geo, especially when it comes to things like tax transparency, but also beneficial ownership. So Tim and Michael, I'll leave it to you guys to give yourselves a proper introduction, but thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and hello, everybody. And thank you for the opportunity to speak to the conference today. My name is Michael Barron. My background is not in the mining sector, and I'm not a geologist. My background is in the oil and gas sector, so a different type of raw materials. I worked for BG Group for many years, particularly on transparency issues. And before we kick off, I'll just let Tim briefly introduce himself as well.
Yeah, thanks very much. So as Sarah said, my background is with Anglo. Neither am I a geologist or material scientist. I'm a chartered accountant, but background as a tax expert. So I was in the tax team for Anglo, responsible for tax transparency and tax reporting and governance and reputation stuff globally for the Anglo Group. But since then, been working on a lot of projects in conjunction with Michael in this kind of transparency space, particularly focusing at the moment on beneficial ownership, which we're going to talk about today in the context of responsible raw materials. But I'll hand back to Michael to kick things off.
Yeah, so Tim and I together have come up with this framework, BO6, which we'll talk about in a minute. But it really is about kind of knowing who is responsible. And as Sarah has already said, kind of complements the previous presentation by Jeff and probably some of the other work we're doing, other talks in this conference. So what we'd like to do is start off by moving on to the next slide. And I think we kind of, when we're talking about responsible raw materials, and so what are responsible raw materials? And we can all say it's all about, minimizing environmental impact or having a beneficial impact on the environment, having beneficial impacts on society and minimizing the adverse impacts on the social fabric. And more importantly, and the bit that maybe gets less emphasis in this context, the G of ESG, good governance, the decision making and monitoring and the rules by which minerals and raw materials are extracted, produced, supplied, and consumed. So we're also, Tim and I was thinking, not just what are responsible raw materials, but therefore what are irresponsible raw materials. And I think, again, it's that there's some quite clear consensus about this. Is obviously processes and activities that damage the environment, damage the social fabric, and poor governance. But also, I think it's something that's slightly beyond that, which is also the balance and equal importance. And any project or any activity that also fails to give environment, society, and governance kind of equal importance could also be have concerns about the level of responsibility or be classed as irresponsible. And it is about, and in this context, it's about the failure to give governance due attention, which could also lead to a major crisis, major reputational damage, increased pressure and scrutiny, just as significant for an environmental risk, environmental crisis, or social crisis. So if your project or your company gets entangled through procurement or some other process in allegations of corruption, money laundering, conflicts of interest, that could cause modern slavery, as the example that Jeff gave just now. This could have as much of an impact, and you'd be seen as irresponsible as whether you've major environmental damage or major adverse impact on a local community or society. And so that's the kind of prism through which we want to see, and the role that a beneficial ownership can play in the governance space and ensuring good governance around raw materials. So with that, I will hand on to Tim.
Thanks, Michael. And I think, as Michael said, it's in the context of that G, the governance piece, that we're going to focus on the concept of ultimate beneficial ownership and beneficial ownership transparency and the role that plays in responsible minerals. My son's former physics teacher would say to him, if it gets tricky, draw a picky. So in that vein, I'm going to use a diagram to try and explain some of the concepts here, because I appreciate that not everybody will be familiar with exactly what ultimate beneficial ownership really means. So let's start off by considering that we have a company which appears to be behaving responsibly and has all those kind of good hallmarks that suggests that it's considering the E, the S, and the G. And we know who that company's parent company is, and they again appear to be behaving in a responsible manner. But then sitting above that parent company, there may well be a complex ownership structure, and that could involve lots of offshore ownership of companies. It could have trusts, it could have bearer shares, it could have all sorts of instruments that mask who the people ultimately behind that company are and what their interests are. So we don't really know what's up there above that. But I'll let you into the secret, which is that one of the interested parties in this structure is, let's say, a prominent politician, possibly one who has an interest in the sector, and may or may not have an interest locally in the country where the operations are. And maybe another interested party at the top of the list is an individual who's on a sanctions list. And I guess the question is, does that then cause a problem for the company at the bottom of the chain? Well, it may do. The sanctions list one probably does. The prominent politician may or may not do, depending on who that politician is and what their role is and where they sit. But at the very least, what this should do is raise some red flags for you. And I think the question for the company at the bottom, I mean, the company at the bottom may not be a company that is here on this call, and I'm not suggesting that it would be. But what about if that company at the bottom is your customer? What about if the company at the bottom is your supplier? And in that situation, then knowing who the ultimate beneficial owners are of that company is relevant in terms of raising red flags over your relationship with that company. Now, most companies already do this to some extent. So they will have customer and supplier due diligence processes. In fact, back in 2018, BHP announced that they were putting together a register of the beneficial ownership of every company in their supply chain, which is over 15,000 suppliers, for their own benefit, in order for them to understand the risk associated with that. But the risks go beyond that. And referring back to Jeff's presentation, that may be about local procurement. What is local procurement, and how do you meet those local procurement rules? And does that require you to understand really who it is that you're dealing with? Is it really is the local company really just a front for something which isn't local? It also is about relevant to identifying corruption, conflicts of interest. Are you dealing with a company which ultimately is a front for a politically exposed person in the country where you're operating? And does that itself potentially bring you into areas of risk, as Michael referred to, that you weren't necessarily aware of? So I think this gives kind of a picture, first of all, of what we mean by ultimate beneficial ownership. We mean those people who are benefiting from or controlling a company. In the mining sector, that's already recognized as being important, and that's why beneficial ownership is part of the EITI standard. But that only applies to beneficial ownership of those companies which are holding licenses or exploring for minerals or oil and gas. It doesn't extend to the supply chain or businesses elsewhere in the economy. So I think where this sits is that the risk extends beyond just understanding the beneficial ownership of companies in the extractive sector. It's also those who are dealing with companies in the extractive sector need to understand the risks that their suppliers and customers potentially bring. So understanding ultimate beneficial ownership, I mean, it's one of the pillars of good governance. It is part of the risk management and risk mitigation of commercial activities of businesses in not just the extractive sector, but here we're talking about the extractive sector. It's about knowing who you're doing business with. It's about knowing ultimately who your suppliers, contractors, partners, and in some cases competitors are. And it's also about governments understanding who the businesses are that are operating in their country. So who ultimately is benefiting from and owns the extractives companies or their major suppliers operating in a country, and are they local businesses? Are they ultimately owned locally? Or are they potentially owned in jurisdictions which are higher risk? Some of which we've obviously talked about earlier today. There is a global trend towards greater beneficial ownership disclosure and transparency. We've seen that in EITI over recent years. The Financial Action Task Force has recommendations that countries look to meet on beneficial ownership, which apply economy-wide. And the EU has also done a lot of work on beneficial ownership transparency, with EU member states required to have public registers of beneficial ownership in place for all companies listed in there, or all companies registered in their jurisdictions. But there isn't a global standard for beneficial ownership transparency. There are various different sort of benchmarks, if you like, but there isn't a single standard. And that in itself causes some issue with the design and implementation phases. But what is clear is that there is a use case on the private sector side, and that's what we've seen from that diagram. Coming on to BO6, which Michael alluded to earlier. So this is the framework, and this is intended for assisting governments in the design and implementation of a beneficial ownership regime. And what it does is it navigates government through 6 stages, through from understanding to then benefiting from the implementation of a beneficial ownership regime. So what do we mean by each of these steps? So understand is about understanding the landscape in which the beneficial ownership regime is being constructed. Each country starts from a different place. It starts from a different place in terms of the shape of the economy, in terms of the risks associated with not understanding beneficial ownership, but also in terms of the level of information which is already available about companies. The next stage is decide. So that's a country deciding on the scope of the beneficial ownership reporting regime it wants to put in place. And that includes critical decisions around what beneficial ownership means, how do you define a beneficial owner, which sorts of companies are in scope, do you have a threshold of ownership which determines that somebody is a beneficial owner, those kind of technical questions. The next stage is design. So that's designing how you're going to collect beneficial ownership information, store it, most importantly, verify it. One of the biggest challenges with beneficial ownership registers is the quality of data in those registers. So verification of data is a very important stage. And then how that information is disclosed and how you enforce the regime. The 4th step is legislate. One of the biggest weaknesses in beneficial ownership transparency in the extractive world around EITI, for example, is that in a lot of cases, there is no legal obligation for companies to disclose their beneficial owners. Along with everything else in EITI, it is down to the local EITI secretariat to influence companies to disclose that information. A robust and economy-wide beneficial ownership regime really needs to be rooted in a legal obligation to disclose. Implementation. This ranges from the sort of IT implementation, systems design, how are you going to collect the data and where are you going to store it, through to the training and awareness raising aspects, and how do you actually make sure that companies know what they need to disclose, and also, just as importantly, if you have a public register, that companies understand how they can use that information. And that leads on to the final one, which is benefit. So making sure that the country benefits from the work that's been done to develop a beneficial ownership reporting regime. That means governments benefiting from understanding the companies that are operating in their country and using that information to tackle corruption, money laundering, the financing of terrorism or other illicit financial flows, but also for businesses to be able to benefit from it in terms of understanding who they're doing business with. I'll pass back to Michael. Oh, you're still muted, Michael.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, so slight technical issue there. And so kind of final stage of this is what can you as a company or as either in the extractive sector, in the raw materials business, as an advisor, involved in this in some way, what can you do about it? And also what can governments or government should do about this? And I think there are several things. One, obviously, is advocate for beneficial ownership registers in countries where you operate. So there are quite a few countries, the EU member states, the UK and others, where they have beneficial ownership registers, but there are a lot of countries which are still thinking about it. They want to do it in terms of to meet their FATF obligations, the Financial Action Task Force obligations, or because they're under pressure, because the EU is a major trading partner. There are drivers for this. But governments often erroneously see this just as imposing another burden on business and think business will be opposed to it. And actually, it's not such, it shouldn't be such a huge burden on business. Reporting your beneficial ownership does require a bit of effort, but it is a fairly minimal burden, and many companies have to know who their beneficial ownership owners are anyway in order to meet KYC requirements when they go to their banks or insurance providers and so forth. And actually there is a public good in this, especially where beneficial ownership registers are public. You spend a little, as a company, you spend a little bit of time submitting your beneficial ownership information to a registry. but you get back the information. You have access to all the information in the register. So, for example, in the UK, you go onto the Companies House website and for free interrogate the Companies House website database and find out the beneficial ownership of companies you're thinking of doing business with, or your suppliers, or even your competitors. And that leads on to the second point, really, which is where there are registers available, make use of them, maximize use of them. Again, in the UK example, Companies House have done their own research, which shows that one of the biggest user groups of their database is small and medium-sized enterprises, exactly at doing it for due diligence purposes, because they can't afford expensive consultants who charge tens of thousands of pounds or dollars for conducting due diligence on suppliers and vendors. And the third bit is understand the risks in your supply chain. Who are the companies that potentially raise red flags? How much do you really know about them? Are they based or in countries which earlier this morning were deemed untrustworthy or you have concerns about? Are they in countries which are on EU or FATF watch lists? Those sorts of, so really understand the risks on supply chain from the governance angle and the risks of inadvertently getting entangled in allegations of corruption, money laundering, conflicts of interest, and those sorts of governance related risks. And for governments, what they can do is demonstrate their commitment to open and trustworthy business environments through and implementing a public beneficial ownership register as part of that. Governments are often reluctant to talk about sensitive issues like money laundering, corruption, but there is a flip side, a positive side, and this is the way Tim and I usually approach this, is that actually this is also about the integrity of the business environment. It's about a more open and competitive business environment, and countries are in competition with one another for investment, for your procurement dollars or your investment dollars, and they can go a long way to helping build trust and the integrity of their business environment through a beneficial ownership reporting regime. And I will end my remarks there and happy to take questions or discuss any aspect of this.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Michael and Tim. A massive round of applause from all of us on the other side of our muted microphone. So thank you very, very much for that. Just time for one very quick question on this. So this comes in from Amanda, and she asks, what do you do when companies are set up in countries without transparent reporting regimes?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of the issue that beneficial ownership transparency is trying to address. At the end of the day, if you have real concerns about the ownership of a country, ownership of a company and where it's based, I mean, the first thing to do is do your own due diligence, ask the company itself. If they are reluctant to disclose their ownership details, that should be a red flag in itself. And then it comes down to a management judgment on whether you're happy to do business with that company. You can use a certain amount of publicly available resources to get so far. In the end, if the supplier or the company is important enough to you, is big enough to you, is material enough to you, it may be worth spending some money with a due diligence provider to dig into the background. But the point is, as beneficial ownership registers become more prevalent around the world, there should be less and less hiding places for companies who are determined to obscure their ownership. And any kind of bad actor, any determined bad actor, will find loopholes, even in the kind of the UK or the EU beneficial ownership registers. But yes, I mean, do your own due diligence, ask the company itself, and at the end of the day, it's a judgment call.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit to that, obviously, to the extent that the company itself is operating in a country which has a register, if its ownership is in a less transparent regime, that should be disclosed in the company's register. So, for example, Michael and I worked on designing the regime in Ghana. If you are a company, a Ghanaian company, you have to disclose your beneficial ownership, even if those beneficial owners are in a country which does not have any kind of transparency on ownership. You have to disclose in the Ghanaian register the ultimate beneficial owners that sit at the very top of that list. I've seen there's a couple of other questions, Sarah. One of those I will answer with a link.
So just on that, we're now running 10 minutes behind, which is 50% behind, unfortunately. So what I'm going to do, Tim, is if you want to answer those questions in chat, that would be awesome.
Absolutely.
But then I also know that Amanda and yourselves are all going to be in the closing panel session. So
Excellent.
we can bring some of them into the panel. So ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for a round of applause for Tim and Michael. Thank you very much. Brilliant. So moving swiftly on and changing into a slightly different direction. So we're going to go back into that world of research. Earlier on today, we heard fantastic insight from Francis with regards to some of the new projects that are beginning to spin up on the circular economy side. Pamela is now going to tell us about one of the big European projects, Miru. And Pamela, I'm going to hand straight over to your lovely self. If you've got slides, go for sharing them now, and I will let you introduce yourself properly. Thank you very much. Over to you, Pamela.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you to you and Rose for the invitation to be here. I will try to talk quickly as well to make up for some time.
It's cool, you've got all the time you need.
Thank you. So everyone, just a quick intro, I guess. I started out as a land use planner in Los Angeles, California, where I am from. And over the years, has somehow moved into being a social scientist, working at the University of Lapland, which is in Rovaniemi, Finland, in the Arctic, on environmental issues in the Arctic, but also on social license to operate in the Nordic countries, as well as more in the pan-European context. So with that, I will share my screen. And okay. So as Sarah said, this presentation will introduce you to a toolbox we developed for a project called MIRU, which is an acronym for Mining and Metallurgy Regions EU. Now, a little bit of background on MIRU. MIRU is a Horizon 2020 project, which is one of those projects that's funded under the European Commission Research Agenda. The main aim of MIRU actually was to network mining and metallurgy regions across Europe through regional administrations. So that was the focus. And part of this comes, of course, from the European Commission now wanting to restart mining in the name of security of supply, for the energy transition, for the Green Deal, for all of these things. MIRU was a really big project because it was about networking. 29 partners, 10 work packages, and I'll mention this in a little bit. The social license to operate work package, which I led, is just 1 out of 10 in this project. The project officially ended recently on April 30th. And I think one of the things that made MIRU very distinct and perhaps opened up the debate wider than it normally would have, is that we decided to try to walk the talk. I mean, we in the SLO work package opened this up to anybody. Anybody from anywhere could join. And they could be a part of the email list, which was not just about newsletters. It wasn't that. There really was a passion actually to try to understand SLO in the European context. And we would have these long email discussions, one around 62 pages, trying to understand what SLO is, how it functions, what its aims are. And we also had monthly calls. We were debating a lot of this substantively. So we made all of our internal discussions open to anybody and everyone. And it's been a really interesting learning experience, and also about transparency and how one handles that. And I've learned I can do that much better. So many lessons on many levels. The big deliverables that we're supposed to come up with were European Union level social license to operate guidelines and an accompanying toolbox. And again, the idea was to try to standardize SLO in the European context, which is a tall order. But I think we made a lot of headway on that, actually. So here's an overview of the toolbox. we went through all of the toolboxes we could find around exploration and mining. And the big demand in Europe was really about relationship building. What do we say when we first go out and meet communities? I mean, how do we build relationships that are supposed to be long lasting, based on trust? We know we're supposed to do this, but how do we do it? So we started thinking about, okay, how do you build a relationship? And then we were thinking, should this apply to the mine life cycle? This is how things are normally divided up. And yet relationship building is cross-cutting across all the stages of mining and across everything. So we just decided to look at the different stages of relationship building, starting with familiarize, then you introduce yourself, you establish the relationship a little bit more, then you really reach out and start to collaborate, and then you strengthen, ideally with something like an impact and benefit agreement and something that's more contractual and has more teeth to it. We developed tools for each of the activities, and the idea of this whole thing is that you can mix and match the tools wherever you are in the relationship process with an individual, with a group. Choose the tools that work for you. And it's funny, I didn't change the slide. But okay, I'm not sure if I'm losing control of my slideshow. This is the toolbox for Europe, however. So you'll see that the relationship building activities are on the left-hand side. The tools we developed are, in this tools category. There are 15 tools. Some were developed from the Miriu project. Some were just developed, actually we adapted from Canada, and I'll show you those later. We categorize, which tools were most useful for which groups, although the majority are for companies. At the end of the day, we also realize these debates are just starting and you need to level the playing field. I'm sorry, you know what? I think I don't know what's happening. I'm not switching the slides, but they seem to be going automatically. So, sorry, well, it'll help me speed up the presentation. The ones that you see in yellow, and I won't go through all of those. I think in some ways, perhaps the more interesting tools are almost the ones we've adapted from Canada, or at least some of them. And especially these financial mechanisms to encourage SLO, because the Canadians have been dealing with this engagement issue and SLO for decades. They have figured out, how do you incentivize engagement, engagement and exploration at the same time. And these financial mechanisms are just targeted to exploration. And they do this actually by having engagement being a legitimate tax deduction, and this is incorporated into the tax code. Legislation was then devised that actually brings kind of these tax incentives into the regulatory framework. And so I think there's some lessons that can be tailored to Europe on that, actually. Grievance mechanism, you're all probably familiar with these environmental monitoring plans, although very standard in much of the world. In Europe, the idea of having the community participate in environmental monitoring is rather new. Same with these community agreements, which are impact and benefit agreement light, essentially. And there was a lot of pushback from industry actually against these, because this somehow binds them contractually. On the other hand, there are also industry people who are participating that were very much for this, as were NGOs, as were authorities, realizing that if you want to actually create a framework to implement SLO and to track that, you need to have some kind of concrete agreement. And this is required already by the World Bank and all these funding institutions. So why not in Europe? But this will be an interesting debate, I think we'll see in the future. And just to go quickly over this, we stepped back and we were looking at stakeholder mapping, because this is one of the big issues going on in Europe of how do you know who your stakeholders are, who can issue an SLO, who cannot. For this presentation, I'm just focusing on this very last box on number 4. And the idea then for this part was not to look at stakeholders in terms of what they do. Are they government? Are they industry? Are they NGO? Are they local community? What are they? It was to shift that to what do they value? What do they believe in, especially in terms of issuing an SLO or of a project gaining acceptance? What has to be in place. And these are trying to reach the more fundamental values people have. So we did this through a survey called the Perceptions of Mining in Europe. It was run across Europe in 7 languages. The idea was not that this was a large-scale random survey. The idea was that we would start with the MIRU partners and try to reach people with some knowledge of mining. And we came up with an SLO model for the MIRU project. This survey tested the model. That's what we did. And we wanted to see, we were testing drivers of social license in Europe. We wanted to see, are there groupings of drivers? Do they somehow come together? And indeed they do, actually. And you'll see these in these stakeholder frames. So for example, the first stakeholder frame is the more traditional idea of SLO, where the company and the the company and the community collaborate, work together, kind of developing, anything from part of the design of a project, through the monitoring, these ongoing relationships. But then there are other groupings that talked about how the societal acceptance of mining in Europe is important. And this goes to the debates about post-consumerism and how much should we really be consuming? Do we need that much mining? What commodities do we need? I'm sorry, it's going. The third stakeholder frame is actually quite important, and I'll come back to that in a later slide, because government plays a very strong role in SLO in Europe. But the idea of these frames is not that an individual fits in one. They can fit in all 5. Groups can fit in all 5. The idea is that these are really crucial issues that will come up in any mining project across Europe. And for industry and government to start building these relationships and start being able to even just get an SLO, you have to consider these and you have to try at least to answer them, but expect they'll come up. So the other tool now are these indicators we came up with to measure SLO, and measurement is a big thing. Just want to put forward that any measurement is a snapshot in time. That is it. But snapshots in time are also helpful for seeing if you're on the right track to getting SLO or not, and what's happening. So the basic idea is you establish a baseline SLO. And here you can see this in the preliminary checklist, the table to the left. Now, the levels on the left, gosh, I'm really sorry. It's okay. The levels on the left correspond to the model that we developed. And we looked at the drivers of gaining SLO and the drivers of losing SLO. This preliminary checklist comes from the model as well. We looked at how these drivers manifest themselves in Europe. The table on your left would establish a baseline SLO. Then the table on your right is how you would measure community SLO. Again, the levels on the left are from the model. We were just interested in, this is a fight. We were just interested in gaining SLO. So the components here come from the model. The measurements are a mix of quantitative indices like this economic index and labor index, as well as a stakeholder survey we've developed, and you'll see on the next slide. So it's capturing also the qualitative aspects of SLO. So these two, quantitative and qualitative, measure the community dimension. And now moving on, the table on the left measures the societal. Again, the levels correspond to the model. The components correspond to the manifestation of how these drivers look in Europe. These are measured against the social sustainable development goals. And the idea being SDGs are very mainstream. People accept them as kind of the societal good practice. And if you're trying to meet the SDGs, somehow there should be a societal acceptance around them. Then the survey, you'll see to the table on your right. And it's basically just some basic questions. This is taken partly from what Robert Boutillier did in a paper in 2017. And Ian Thompson also, worked with him earlier on these issues. So it's basically kind of measuring certain key drivers that people have found across the world on SLO and ranking them. And the idea is then you add up all of the scores and you get your total project SLO score. So last slide here, thoughts for future uptake. Because this was really collaboratively done, we consistently worked with about 150 people across Europe, partners and non-partners in MIRU, people who are interested in it and who join the calls constantly. There was a lot of input and it took a lot of time to develop the tools. So I should have thought better about how do you get people to take these up? How do you get government interested, which is really initially who they were supposed to be for, and industry interested? And I think what's really true in Europe is you see the case for mining actually has not been well made. There are areas where there's been mining, where there will continue to be mining, it's supported, but this largely is because of identity and history and jobs. In other regions, I think people are very much questioning why, why they need it. They don't see that as the future of Europe. They see Europe beyond this, of course, IT and services, which requires a lot of mining, but that connection hasn't quite been made. And when we asked companies, when we finally got this developed and we said, okay, will you test these? Some of the companies told us, look, we do SLO better than you ever could. We don't need this. Others told us there are no issues or no problems. Don't raise them. We don't want to do anything. We just want to hold back and let things go on as they have been. And then there are a lot of others who said, we tried communication and it really didn't work. And we really don't want to open ourselves up again. So there really is a need to think through, gosh, how do you get people to use these? On the last point, it goes to that other slide where I mentioned government plays a really strong role. And because the state historically has been strong, the welfare state models, is still very supported in Europe. And authorities view their roles as being quite structured and strict. And so the idea of bringing in more of this soft law stuff of social license, is something that they don't understand how to integrate because it is not there in legislation or in regulation. So trying to understand how you really mesh these things together so they're usable is a big challenge, but something also that really needs to be done. So, okay, I think my presentation wanted me to finish earlier. Sorry. Say if you have any questions or you want to discuss anything, please always feel free to contact me.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Pamela. So ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the wonderful Pamela Lesser. Thank you very much, Pamela. That's brilliant. So just one very, very quick question, and I know that there are some questions in the chat for you. You mentioned things like the issuing of an SLO or getting that as a tangible thing. Now, as far as I was aware, a social license to operate isn't a physical piece of paper. It's something that's fairly transient. And am I correct in that, or am I misinterpreting something?
You are very correct in that. And I probably shouldn't have used that word. There's no tangible paper. There is no license that is being issued. And that is one of the confusions, and also why at least authorities in Europe don't like it, because it confuses the real license or the license they issue with. Basically, the idea was also saying that the community acceptance is just as important as a legal license. This is the basis of it, but there's no tangible piece of paper.
Fantastic. Thank you, Pamela. And then the other thing as well there is that so within Europe, there isn't actually, compared to somewhere like Canada, Australia, parts of Africa, there's not actually very much physical mining. There's a lot of old mining, and there's potential for a lot of new mining coming in. Is that something where actually the social license to operate is something that is very different, say in the European context, compared to something like the Canadian context? Would that be true?
It is true. You look at Canada and you look at Australia, and these are mining countries. Mining is part of their identity. Not true in general in Europe. Yes, there are places, and Cornwall is definitely one of these, where mining is part of their heritage and they're very proud of it, and it will continue to be, and their identity is bound up with mining. But in much of Europe, no. And also when you do look at just the numbers and how it contributes to GDP and all that, it's a very small percentage. So making the argument that we are going to have environmental and social impacts, no doubt, we will do this as best as we can, as responsibly as we can, but there will be impacts. For a very small part of the economy, and it tends to be in rural, underdeveloped areas, it's not an easy argument to make.
And one final question as well is that, so whilst I guess my inference there was around things like base metal mines, for example, of course, there's a huge construction materials industry. And the work that you did, was that primarily focused in on things like base metals, or did you also include quarries and construction materials?
Miri was only about metals. We didn't look at quarries. That's it. Because social license to operate, I think you have to include it. It's such a huge part of the mining in Europe that you need to. So we actually included quarries, and we also looked at coal, which was also not part of MIRI. So we were trying to capture everything in what we did.
Cool, brilliant. Well, with that, thank you very, very much, Pamela. Ladies and gentlemen, another round of applause for Pamela. Thank you very much. Brilliant. And congratulations on the project.
Thank you.
We're going to stick with the European context, and we're going to go from people to rocks. And I know that, well, I'm certainly excited by this. Not that I'm not excited by people. And again, I can feel myself getting into trouble with any more comments that might come out of my mouth. But without further ado, I'm going to pass straight across to Mark Burnett. And I think we are sharing Mark's slides. Yep, we are. Fantastic. And Mark is going to talk to us about some of the developments, some of the updates that are being made to the European standard and guidelines with regards to the reporting of minerals. So Mark, I'll invite you to introduce yourself and take it away. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. And luckily, we have the expert on the panel who can answer a lot of the questions that may come up as to how this all developed. So, ladies and gentlemen, PERC is the Pan-European Reporting Code. So it has been raised several times what regulates publicly listed companies. In Europe, this is the Pan-European Reporting Code. It's part of the, next slide, please, Rose. Part of what is referred to as the CRISCO group of codes. Now, in the past, everybody is worried about financial shenanigans going on. So most mining people are very familiar with things like the Poseidon Nickel saga, BRIEX, and various other financial mining implications or things that have went wrong on the financial side. But what has been, and this then led to what was referred to as the Denver Accords, which then developed into the CRISCO reporting standards. And as you can see, large parts of the world are covered by some sort of regulatory framework. And the basis of these codes basically resides in effectively 3 to 4 principles. That the information that is discussed is material, is transparent, that the people reporting that information are competent in what they're doing, and that, at least in PERC, there's a degree of accountability in terms of the professionals and organizations involved with this. Next slide, please, Rose. Now, in terms of the responsibility and the people signed up to PERC, as you can see there, there's six professional organizations, all which have a standard and reporting code. So there is a code of ethics which the professionals involved with them are required to report to. There is enforceable disciplinary procedures that can be invoked on members who do not do the job accurately and ethically. And we need to keep ourselves up to date in terms of what is going on. Next slide, please, Rose. Now, the way that we report things, and the way that has been reported, is referred to as Table 1, where you can see as we move from geological confidence, we classify our rocks in terms of inferred, indicated, and measured. To get to something we can mine economically or extract to make money, which has always been the focus of at least a Western capitalist-driven society where you have to make money in terms of what you're doing, we would then, or the technical professionals would then apply what's referred to as the modifying factors, which you can see down at the bottom. Now, 90% of the time, these are focused on the hardcore technical aspects, mining, processing, metallurgy, and economics. There has been notification of discussing things like environmental and social, but those have all taken a relatively low-key role in comparison to the technical aspects. However, this all changed on the 23rd of May 2020 when a very large international mining company decided that in the mine expansion that some caves were getting in the way and they were removed. I don't think anyone really anticipated the backlash that would come from civil society in terms of this happening. It was out in the bush, no one really cared about it, or no one thought anyone would care about it until the social aspects were raised. And if you've been following the press, you'll see that the shareholders of the specific company 7 days ago, 60% of the shareholders voted against remuneration packages for the executives of the company. The vote was taken under advisement, which means the company didn't actually have to take this into account, but it's showing that shareholders are becoming increasingly concerned about non-technical aspects and how this is impacting, including in places which are remote. Next slide, please. And this is some work that was done by Smith and Williamson, just showing that there's a growing concern from investors, and this has been discussed several times by other presenters, so I won't belabor this point. But people are becoming more and more aware that it's not just all about making the money. There are lots of implications. It's no longer a case of, you know, if we do mining and we do it in an emerging economy, that things can happen like they have done in the past. There's a growing concern that there's a growing concern that we need to take into account cultural heritage, and it's not just a case of, you know, might is right, and the big mining company can go in and do whatever they want, however they want, and walk away with no implications and no consequences. Next slide, please. So, how is this all taken into account? Now, the way that most technical reports have been written in the past, and which most people are familiar with, is like PERC, JORC, NI 43-101. They have certain requirements in terms of reporting the reserves. Now, a specific person or an individual is appointed to effectively coordinate and conduct the group of technical professionals to get involved in this. And generally, the analogy used as being the lead competent person is like a conductor, and he or she needs to be aware or ensure that all the people in the team are competent in the areas of expertise. So the lead competent person, or in terms of the NI 43-101 reporting requirements, the qualified person has to be at least familiar with the minimum standards that the technical professionals need to adhere to within the specific areas of expertise. Next slide, please. Now, what has happened, and this gets back to ongoing professional development, is with the growing forces of ESG coming through and impacting on the financial aspects of reporting and reporting codes. What PERC did, or rather what Crisco did, is then start investigating and expanding on the ESG requirements in our technical reporting codes. So what PERC was then mandated to do is to expand on this, where Sarah Gordon and Catherine McCullum basically led the team on the expansion of the PERC ESG requirements, which led to greater expansion of what's referred to as Chapter 13 and the requirements, and then also in what's referred to as Table 1, a detailed checklist of the requirements that need to be included in any technical report that gets done. Now, I should have commented that these are for publicly listed companies only. There still obviously remains a concern that companies, and this is something that I've noticed, a lot of companies feel that some of these ESG requirements are becoming too onerous. So what is happening is they start delisting from the various stock exchanges and go private, where these type of transparency rules or requirements no longer apply. So getting back to PERC, so what PERC now includes in terms of the guidance of the information that should be included in the technical reports is that nice long list of things that you can see, which gives competent people like me some additional bedtime reading before we can make sure or ensure that the team players in our technical report are actually competent in terms of what they're doing. Next slide, please, Rose. However, just when you think that it can't get worse in terms of additional reading, when you start looking from a purely legal point of view, this is what a minimum list that Baker and McKenzie suggest should be considered when doing any reporting requirements, and the ESG things that should be included or at least considered in technical reports when you're looking at the modifying factors and in terms of, can we mine this area economically and make money out of it without upsetting too many people, or rather without actually doing things which will upset and bring the technical person into violation of the ethical standards and requirements. Next slide, please. So what PERC now does is, for any public reporting code, we've now moved away from just pure technical reporting documentation, such as quarterly reports, annual reports, competent persons reports, and we now include things such as environmental and sustainability statements must include the information required in terms of PERC. We also now need to include things like the potential environmental impact of the exploration. So a lot of cases, a resource would be quoted with very little consideration in terms of longer term ESG aspects. There would be on mine or company related environmental concerns and procedures and protocols to follow, but this generally didn't translate itself through into the documentation that was required, or even the thinking process that the geologists would apply to the work that they were doing. Next slide, please, Rose. So these are some of the things which are and will be noted in the new PERC code when it comes out later on this year, that we now need to include, or the competent person needs to understand, have demonstrable awarenesses of this, and what the critical standards and principles are that are required in this. So again, it's not just a case of being focused on a single code or running through a tick box exercise to say, yes, we've included IFC rules, World Bank rules, and everything else. It's now getting to the stage that, next slide, please, Rose. It's now getting to the stage that we're moving away from purely following a legal code. We're now getting to the stage of geoethics, an aspect of, as at least speaking as a geologist, we can't just sit back and say we've done a technical tick box, we've ticked everything. We need to understand the bigger issues that will impact on societies as a whole in the areas that we operate in. Thank you very much. And I have completed that with, I think, on time.
Perfect. That is a beautiful. Thank you very, very much, Mark. So, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for a wonderful round of applause for Mark Burnett. Thank you very much. Brilliant. So Mark, you mentioned that, of course, PERC has been updated, which is great. What are the next steps? How can we get a hold of that update? And are the other codes, etc., around the world making use of it?
Well, I think Ruth may want to step in here as well. So Ruth, can I pass that one to you?
Ruth is finding that video button and that mute button. There she is.
Yeah, I can't remember the exact date, Sarah, but we're just tidying up some comments we've had from our sort of slightly wider but still in the community consultation group. And then the standard, it's a standard, not a code, in fact, because it hasn't got mandatory force. It's not backed up by legislation as JORC, for example, is. So it's just a nuance, but it's a standard that's exactly the same in many ways as all the other CRISCO codes and standards. I think in the summer it'll be published as a consultation draft.
Cool, excellent. So consultation draft, which I guess then means that, because I'm aware that JORC, which is the Australian code, and 43101, which is the Canadian code, and then many of the other nations around the planet are also taking a look at how does ESG really manifest within their own codes. I guess they will then be able to get a proper look at it and ascertain if they want to pull anything across to their codes. Is that correct?
Well, they've already had a proper look at it because they've had a look at it, because the whole of the CRISCO community has been consulted. And so we've got input from all of the other national reporting organisations, which is what we call the members of CRISCO. So yeah, that conversation is really alive and progressing within CRISCO, as you say, and each member of CRISCO, each NRO, is proceeding at its own pace and with its own constraints. And when we look at Australia and Canada, there are legal issues too, which may frustrate. We're a bit more nimble in PERC because we don't have those legal constraints. But it's another conversation about whether there should be stronger regulation in Europe of this kind of thing. But yeah, it's coming soon, and it will be completely available to anybody who wants to look at it.
Brilliant, thanks, Ruth. So one final question. And for those ladies and gentlemen on the line who are thinking, what are they talking about? PERC, CRISCO, JORC? I have no idea. Is this a different language? If you go to the little webpage that I've just posted, that contains a little bit of a glossary, or at least an interpretation of what these things actually mean. Basically, it's a world of geology stuff. Okay, and Maeve Boland has been fantastic and posted a question. So Mark, I don't know if you want to take this one. Maeve asks, the European Commission is enthusiastic about another acronym, UNFC, but thank you, Maeve, for telling us what that is. So that's the United Nations Framework Classification of Resources. How does this fit with PERC? And do they use similar reporting or similar approaches with regards to the ESG reporting?
Okay, the simple answer is they do match. They have different audiences. So the UNFC code tends to be more for governments and parastatals that are looking at total, effectively, resource rent in a country. So all aspects. So if it's the minerals and materials that can lead to something. PERC, or rather the Crisco codes, are designed for an investor market. So you've now got something that which you want to turn to economic account. So it's very easy to map PERC, or rather the Crisco codes, back onto UNFC. Because UNFC tries to cover such a wide area of material, it's not always that easy to map UNFC requirements in reverse order. If you go to the another acronym, UNECE, I think it was the 13th conference that they hosted, all the presentations are available, and there's a number of case studies done by, I think, the British Geological Society Survey, I think the Finnish Geological Survey, and a number of others, where they take you through case studies in terms of how they've mapped information between the two different reporting codes. And earlier on, Professor Wall was also discussing how this is going to be done. So there's actually a lot of information out there. You're free to drop me an email. I'll go and, in fact, let me go and hunt down the website, and I'll go and post it as well in the chat box. It's probably the easiest way of solving the problem.
Thank you very much, Mark. And I know that Ruth is desperate to come in very, very quickly on UNFC.
Yeah, just to clarify that UNFC is a framework classification. It's a classification system. It has no codified reporting standards within it. So that's the distinction, that the Crisco codes and standards are reporting standards for primarily the investment community for disclosures. There is exact congruence between the classification upon which the reporting standards are based and part of the United Nations Framework Classification for Resources, but the UNFC is much bigger. It covers many other classes of raw materials and resources, and there's lots of cooperation and discussion between the two communities, between Crisco and UNECE, and also very fruitful discussions about how to generate effective reporting standards associated with the wider UNFC, and incorporating this whole concept of competency and transparency, materiality, and so on. So yeah, and as Francis mentioned, this is absolutely crucial.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Ruth. And Mark, a final round of applause and massive thanks from all of us. So ladies and gentlemen, round of applause for the wonderful Mark and the interloper Ruth as well on the questions. Brilliant.
Thank you.
So we're going to move from the geology into the money, and gives me great pleasure to introduce to you actually somebody who started off life as a gemologist, and so she's not too far away from the rockyology world of some of the people you've just heard from. So Amanda comes to us, and Amanda, I'm going to let you introduce yourself more fully, but Amanda's going to give us insight as to, okay, so if you are acting on behalf of investors, or if you are an investor, how might you do this in a way so that you truly incorporate sustainability factors, or ESG, into your selection criteria, and then also how you might support operations in being as responsible as possible. So ladies and gentlemen, I now give you Amanda van Dijk. Thank you very much.
So am I sharing my screen?
You are indeed. We see the PowerPoint version at the moment, but I'm sure we'll see the presentation bit soon.
Give me 1 second and it's
There we go. It's just coming.
there we go. I'm not the world's best tech person, despite the fact that studying tech is what I do. So post becoming a gemologist, I ended up studying economics. Sorry, 1 second.
It's not quite working yet, but just while Amanda is finding that, I don't know, you did click the button. I saw it being clicked, but if not, we could always go through it in this viewpoint if you like. So Amanda was instrumental in picking up the Women in Mining network in the UK a number of years ago. And so many of you on the line will probably recognize Amanda as she's finding the slides. I think we do have a backup copy of your slides this end, if necessary.
Okay. Yeah, I'm really sorry about this.
It's okay.
It's not changing either. There we go. Is that working for everybody?
So we can see your slides, and we're just seeing the PowerPoint version, but that's fine, Amanda. It's okay, and we can edit in the final video.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what to do here.
Okay. I tell you what, Rose, do we have Amanda's slides from previously? Or Amanda, if you just stop sharing for a second.
Yeah, I can share them.
Again. Okay, so Amanda, we can share your slides from our end. So I will take back control, and then Rose will share from her end, and you just need to say, next slide, please, Rose, in the dulcet tones of Mark, because he did such a good job with that earlier.
Sorry, oh my goodness.
So we can share from this end, Amanda, if you like, or do you want to go for
1 second? I need to something on my side. I'm really sorry for that, about this.
That's okay. So just while we're sorting that out with Amanda, just going back to our previous talk, you can see that Amanda will be talking about metals for the green economy. And I think something that's really interesting, especially when we look at the updates to the mineral reporting codes and guidelines, etc., and standards that are out there, is that increasingly we need to be cognizant of different types of metals and materials. So, for example, lithium is an interesting one, because lithium, you can dig lithium out the ground in a solid form. So you can dig hard rocks out of the ground, and some of the minerals contain, or in some of the rocks contain lithium. But actually, a huge proportion of the world's supply of lithium comes from brines, which we suck out of the ground from beneath the salt flats in the likes of Chile and Argentina, etc. So what this means is that sometimes it's quite difficult to say, okay, how do we report on exactly how much is in the ground, what the quality or the concentration of those different materials actually are. And then, of course, beyond that, really making sure that we do include the different aspects of ESG, which, as we've discussed earlier on this week, can be very, very difficult to be able to quantify, which is often what people are trying to search for, especially when they're trying to measure all of this. So Amanda, I see that you're back with us. Do you want to share the slides your end, or do you want?
No, you're fine with sharing them, and I'll just ask to switch them when necessary. I should mention, unlike many of the people, after studying gemology, which got a little bit boring because it was about shiny rocks, I ended up going into economics, and the fundamental basis of this presentation is about the economics. And economics is about the allocation of scarce resources, supply and demand, and about the stakeholder that often gets forgotten in a lot of these frameworks, which is the consumers that buy the stuff at the end of the day. If we can jump to the next slide. Those consumers are pushing something that is a well-trodden financial concept, which is a new commodity super cycle. And that super cycle has two main components. It's about significant new demand coming into the space for commodities, and it's being pushed by the global transition to the green economy, as well as the transition of the rural economy, mostly in the developing world, to urban environments and technologically dense urban environments that demand a lot of metals. Next slide, please. And so the first thing I want to do is sort of tell you what a commodity super cycle is. And fundamentally, a commodity super cycle is where you have it's a decade-long thing of ups and downs in commodity prices, where you have extreme above trend metal prices that are driven usually by significant new industrialization and modernization. And the urbanization, the technology-driven urbanization, as well as the new green economy, are where that in modern industrialization that's demanding significantly above trend demand. Next slide, please. Now, the best way to talk about that is to talk about old super cycles, and it'll make more sense in our context. So the super cycles we're all mostly aware of, that we know of from history, are when in World War II, when we had to massively arm, and all those that armament was heavily commodity intensive, we had a significant super cycle that happened for that arming and for that rearmament on a global context. And then most recently, we had a super cycle led by China, when China performed, frankly, an economic miracle and moved about 500 million people out of rural poverty into the urban modern economy, and significantly helped their human economic development. And the demand that put on the global mine supply was very, very significant. And by doing that, we had to produce a lot more metals. As you can see, the mining and metals index and the price we were demanding for it went up significantly during that period. But once the mine supply came on board, the prices dropped again, because that's part of the cycle. The prices go up and the prices come down, and then they settle on a new baseline equilibrium that's based on how much we consume per person in the world. Next slide, please. And the reason that consumption is very correlated to humanity is because consumption is a fundamental part of who we are and what we do. And that consumption ultimately all comes back to raw materials, whether they're food that's grown globally right now by, I mean, the amount of food we eat in the world that keeps us all happy, healthy, and fed, or most of us happy, healthy, and fed, is there because commercially mined fertilizers help its production. And on average, an American person, which is kind of the baseline of the highest consumption in the world, consumes about 3.6 million tons per person in the US. And that's a huge amount of stuff. Now, it's not just fertilizer and iron ore. It's also stuff like concrete and sand and water, certain kinds of water and materials and liquids and all that kind of stuff. But overall, it all comes out of the ground one way or another. And we use it to make our lives better, frankly. Next slide, please. And I know a lot of people are like, I don't consume that much. I'm very efficient. I recycle, but we do. As mentioned a number of times, every single one of us is participating in this conference using a computer that has a lot of little metals in it, and we have a phone in our pockets, almost whether it's an iPhone or something else, that has a huge amount of metals in it. And you compound that by the, I don't know, 5-6 billion phones that are in active use in the world every day. And that's a lot of mining in metals. Next slide, please. And it's not just the phones are small, relatively speaking, and that's a compounded effect, but it's also the cars. And the cars, and you're like, well, but I don't drive a car, I take public transport. Well, then you're using, trains and buses and planes, and all of them are really commodity intensive. And the thing that's driving this new commodity intensity per person is the fact that this new technology that is much better. I mean, the iPhone's a lot better than your old Nokia. And the Tesla is an amazing electric vehicle that is greener per se and uses different kinds of fuel, but it's also about twice as heavy. And it uses 3 or 4 times more copper. On average, because there's different metals and it's not the exact same thing, but on average, the average electric vehicle uses twice as much metal as a former internal combustion engine. Next slide, please. And that goes into that transition to the green economy. And that transition is fundamentally being led by consumers. The world has mostly signed up to the Paris Accord, which means net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And in addition to that, it means that we are going to have to transition we've all agreed that we don't want to go above 2 degrees centigrade. And in order to not go above 2 degrees centigrade increase by 2050, we're going to have to change the way we consume very, very fundamentally. In the UK, we've decided we're going to build the Saudi Arabia of wind, which means tens of thousands of huge windmills that are all built of metal. And by 2030, you're not going to be able to buy an internal combustion engine. It's even harder, frankly, in the EU, where they've said by 2025, you're not going to be allowed to buy an internal combustion engine. You need to buy either a hybrid or an electric vehicle. And in addition, they have the new European sustainability taxonomy and carbon pricing. So if you want to produce in the EU or import into the EU, you're going to have to prove your carbon emissions and make sure they're low and or pay a tax. In the US, they've done what Americans do, and they're spending $1.7 trillion on green initiatives, which is amazing. But nonetheless, that's going to completely change the way we are consuming in the world. And that consumption is metals intensive. This green technology is is much more metals intensive than the other technologies, which were fossil fuel intensive, for lack of another way of putting it. Next slide, please. And that transition, I'm trying to put it in terms that sort of can make practical sense. We sold 63 million cars in the world last year. 2.5% of them were electric or hybrid. By 2030, in Europe and we're going to be selling only those cars. But in the world, we have committed via Paris mostly to 30 by 2030, which means 30% electric vehicles by 2030. But that alone is 10 times more metal than we presently use in vehicles. We'll need 40 times more metal to create all the vehicles per annum if we still consume that many vehicles by 2050. That's huge. If we want to build enough wind, according to the International Renewable Energy Agency, to meet all of those targets that Paris and our governments have set for us, we'll need 14 times more wind capacity than we presently have. 14 times more of those huge wind farms all over the world, and about 9 times more of those solar farms. Next, please. In fact, on an annual basis, by 2050, if we want to go to that medium case scenario that everyone's promised to do under Paris, we're going to need about 4 times more metals and minerals produced every year than we presently produce in the world. That's a lot of metals and minerals. And that means we're going to have to significantly ramp up supply of those minerals. It won't all come from mines. I think it's absolutely necessary, as mentioned earlier, that we get into the circular economy and recycle as much as we can. But we are going to need significantly more production than we presently have. And it's coming from a slow base, like 2.5% for electric vehicles as an example. We're starting at 2.5% this year and hoping to get to 30% by 2030, but that's still exponential growth. And that means that we're going to have to seriously change the way in which we find these minerals and the way in which we produce them. Next slide, please. And I think everyone's going to answer why. Why is it so metal intensive? So I thought I'd give you a bit of an example in the major areas. Solar panels, which seem to be all made of glass, are basically all mined metals or minerals. And glass, contrary to popular belief, does come out of the ground, and it comes from sand. Now, I know you like the sand when you're on the beach, but for those of us in the industry, it's a very important industrial mineral that goes into concrete and solar panels. But there's lots of other little metals, and as we've as I explained earlier, when you compound that by the number of panels in the world, that's quite a bit of metal. Next, please. Wind power, which arguably is turning into one of the most efficient forms of renewable power in the world, next to probably nuclear, is incredibly metals intensive. I mean, it's 4.7 tons of copper in every single one of those things, 2 tons of rare earths, 335 tons of steel, not to mention the concrete, which has sand and a number of other things that are industrial minerals in it. And they don't last forever. They need to be serviced. And they do have a reasonably long life, but they do need to be replaced. And that demand, first we need to build them, and then we need to get it at sort of equilibrium replacement value over time. Next, please. And then there's the cars. The cars are what everybody's really excited about. And I'm going to deal with, instead of going to all the way by 2050, when we assume everybody will be driving electric vehicles and hopefully fewer of them, we're just going to talk about getting to 2030, the next 10 years. The next 10 years requires annual, just to service the cars, so not overall metals and minerals demand in the world, which is spread out in a lot of industries, but just to build those cars, we need about 7 times more metal. And we're ramping up every year, and you can see how that curve goes. And that metal is important. And if we want to get to carbon, a carbon-free economy where we're not using fossil fuels, ironically, we're going to have to mine a lot more metal to do it. And it's a different kind of raw material, and it's a different kind of consumption. I'm very sorry. Health and safety. We always have these once a week. You'll be okay.
Beautiful timing, Amanda.
Oh my goodness. Well, health and safety, it's everywhere these days. It's not just in the mines anymore. It started when I first got into this industry. I was overwhelmed by the amount of health and safety, but now it seems to have permeated everything. It's a good thing. I'm not complaining. But yeah, if we're going to get to the levels that just about every government on the planet has promised to get to, the ramp up of metals supply is going to be a challenge that we're all going to have to get into, and we're going to have to manage it within a price context, because frankly, I'm not sure we can afford exponential growth in the metals prices. It's going to have to be done in a different way. But the topic of this conference is not just the price change. But next slide, please. What metals, where, and how. So one of the things I should mention is we talked about overall metals indexes and how much more metal we're going to need. It's not consistent across all commodities. Everyone talks about nickel for electric vehicles, but fundamentally, we're going to need to double the amount of nickel supply, but that's about it. Graphite and lithium, on the other hand, might have to go up about 500% in terms of global production. And that's not to say it's not possible. It is possible. And that's also, next slide, please. Not to say it's going to be consistent. This is our best bet. This is the people at Rio Tinto and MIT got together to figure out which metals were going to be most affected by new technology. And this is their best bet today. Technology is not static. Right now, we're using a lot of lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. There's a good chance that we'll end up using a lot of phosphate going forward for a different type of battery technology. Right now, we think that grid scale energy storage is likely to be heavily vanadium based, but there's a reasonable chance that zinc batteries, in my opinion, might replace that as a safer and more cost-effective alternative to grid scale electric storage. This is our best bet today based on the technologies that we think are going to be dominant. But either way, it doesn't matter. Regardless of the technology, the one thing technology has told us consistently is that it's metals intensive. It might be vanadium, it might be zinc, but either way, it's going to be a metal. And so in order to prepare for that, we need to prepare for how we're going to get all that metal, which is the subject of this conference. Next slide, please. And it's those implications. All of this demand for green energy is coming from a world that says, and consumers around the world that say, I want to live in a cleaner world. I want to live in a kinder world. The reason they want all this stuff is for very good reasons. And that's the catch-22. They don't want the metals at any cost. They don't want renewable power with a horrible carbon footprint. They don't want iPhones that use child labor in their creation. It's just a fact. And they're willing to pay for it. They're willing to pay more. How much they're willing to pay is still yet to be tested, but they've been very clear. They want it, but they don't want it at any cost. And the last super cycle and the super cycles that came in previous generations were kind of metals at any cost because there was no consumer interaction. But right now that has changed. That's changed very significantly. And I think that if we're going to meet this challenge of finding those metals and those minerals to supply into the new green economy and transforming the economic development of so many people from the developing world with technology, then we're going to have to do it differently than we did it in the past. And it's not impossible, as this conference has laid out to all of us. It's extremely possible. We have lots of tools at our disposal to do it in a sustainable way. And we're not really going to have a choice, because at the end of the day, we produce mining and metals for the world, for consumers. And the consumers have been very clear in terms of what they want. Next slide, please. One of the things I wanted to bring up here today is recycling. There's a bit of, and this is actually something that I believe that the consumers of the world don't quite understand yet. Recycling will play a huge role in the circular economy in the long term. But in the short term, the reality is that we don't have enough end-of-life material that's properly collected, and we don't have the technology or the infrastructure to process it. So recycling is kind of at the stage in terms of a global industry that let's say wind and renewable power was about 10 years ago. It's a good idea. We're all on board for it, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done to figure it out, because much like mining, they don't want the metals at any cost. They don't want recycling at any cost either. They don't want recycling if it uses really horrible, dangerous chemicals, and it's far more energy intensive than the creation of the original metal to begin with. There's a lot of things that we need to get to, and that's a combination of technology and building enough recycling and having enough collected end-of-life supply to fill into that. Next slide, please. And that's where the economics of recycling becomes very, very important. We're getting there. We have some recycling facilities. Believe it or not, the Chinese are some of the best recyclers on the planet. And the world actually has there are a couple of metals that we have a great, aluminum and copper. The world has really figured out how to recycle those, and they are mature industries with lots of infrastructure and acceptable and technology that's been figured out for the recycling of them. Lithium-ion batteries, we're not quite there yet. There is lithium-ion battery recycling. China does tons of it. They're excellent at it, actually. But our industries are in their infancy. And well, I think in 10 years, when a lot of those when the beginnings of the end of life electric vehicles and some of the solar panels, et cetera, are coming there, they will be recycled. And I think the industry will be there when it gets there, but they are going to form a part of the metals demand story, not all of it. I mean, it would be lovely if we recycled everything and we could get everything from recycled materials, but the real reality of what's available from recycled supply and how much we need in the short term means that there will be an increasingly important position recycling has to play in what we do, but it won't be there at the very end. It won't be there yet. We're getting there, but it's going to take some time, and it's a space that we'll get there in the long run. Next slide, please. So this is probably more information that we've already covered, but yeah, we're getting there. It's almost there. Some things are well recycled, but I would say my personal call is about 2030, where recycling is properly integrated into long-term metal demand. That's how long it's going to take to get the recycling industry globally up to a level where we effectively recycle all of the electronics, cars, and renewable power that we have into a significant portion of the long-term supply. Next slide. And so the conclusion of all of this is, the truth is the transition to the green economy and economic development of the globe is going to require a great deal metal on a per capita basis than we have ever required in the history of mankind in the past. And that means that the industry that it's supplying into it, those raw materials, those very critical raw materials, is going to have to up its game. It's going to have to get bigger, and it's going to have to get, it's going to have to change the way that it does its business, because that's what its end consumers are demanding of it. And as we've seen at this conference, there's a lot of ways to do that. We're already halfway there. That's it.
Brilliant. That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much, Amanda. So from all of us on the other side of our muted microphones, thank you very much for an absolutely phenomenal talk. There were so many facts, figures in there, and you made it incredibly clear as to what that overarching picture looks like. Now, we've got some great questions coming in, not just from the other panelists. What I'm going to do, actually, just in the interests of time, because I know that that Joel may be called away to be daddy duty at some point in time. Amanda, you can stick around with us for the panel just after, can't you? Brilliant. So
I'll answer all the questions then.
Fantastic. So I'm just going to go. So another round of applause for Amanda, please, ladies and gentlemen, whilst I welcome Joel to the screen. So Joel, if you want to find that good old mute button, there we go. So ladies and gentlemen, I bring to you the fantastic Dr. Joel Gill. Joel, do you want to introduce yourself briefly for everybody so we all know who you are?
Sure. I have the pleasure, the privilege, sometimes the challenge of wearing multiple hats. So by day, I work at the British Geological Survey, where my research is focused on disaster risk reduction, but also very much focused on sustainable development and international development in the context of the survey's work. By evening, weekends, any other time that I can find, I lead a charity, Geology for Global Development, which is focused on mobilizing and equipping geoscientists around the world to engage in the UN Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2030. And then another bit of time I need to find is also to function as the Secretary for Foreign and External Affairs at the Geological Society of London. But the three experiences really bring together lots of aligned and common themes around good practice, building strong partnerships, thinking about working collaboratively internationally.
And of course, most importantly, you are a daddy to two fantastic little children, one of whom was only born fairly recently.
Yeah, so 8 weeks ago today, pretty much. So kind of sleep is fairly minimal. So if there are rambling responses to your questions today, Sarah, then please have patience.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Joel. I think one of the main reasons why we're sitting here today is because congratulations, Joel. And another baby, as it were, was launched. I think originally it was supposed to be launched sort of now, but the publishers went for it a bit early. And so I'm really pleased to have a copy of your brand new book here. Do you want to tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, well, I'm glad somebody's bought them. I've got one as well. But interest of transparency, I don't get any royalties from sales. So just to make sure people don't think I'm trying to boost my pension fund. So this is a book that really we started about 4 years ago. So the charity that I run has been at the forefront of really looking at the role of geoscience in the Sustainable Development Goals. We hosted a conference on the matter in 2015, a matter of weeks after the SDGs were agreed. We published a paper soon after. And really, we wanted to start to look in detail at each of the SDGs and the role of geoscience in those, but also what we need to do as a community to evolve, to change, to reform, so that we can ensure that the greatest likelihood of meeting what is an incredibly ambitious but incredibly exciting vision set out in the 2030 agenda. So it's been a 4-year project. The book has been edited by myself and Martin Smith, who leads our international work at the Geological Survey. But we have 42 authors from 6 continents around the world. It's really a collective global voice that we've brought together that sets out very clearly the exciting role that geoscience has in this agenda, but also the fact that we need to really take a look at how we work and think about the steps that we need to do to increase the likelihood of delivering the ambitions of the UN agenda.
Thanks, Joel. And I mean, with regards to this book, I mean, who is it aimed at? Is this something for anybody to read, or is it something that actually, to be honest, if you're a bit more into the depths of the science and the technical side of geoscience, this is the book for you?
I think there's a bit of a dual function there. So I think what we've included in the book is really trying to set geoscience in the context of the social, political, economic aspects of sustainable development. Sustainability is notably lacking in many of the educational, the training courses that geoscientists have. And I think that's something that really needs to change for geoscientists to play a full role in delivering the SDGs. So there's an aim there at geoscientists to show them their relevance to the SDGs, to try and catalyze engagement, greater engagement in the SDGs, but also to support educators of diverse types to bring in the SDGs and core skills around sustainability, whether it's stakeholder or context mapping, whether it's policy analysis, into the training of geoscientists. But I think the level that we've written this at, it also means that it could well be on the shelves of those who are working in development agencies, in UN agencies, because each chapter is focused on the development ambition rather than the geoscience sub-theme, for example, to pick it up and to look at, why should we engage with earth scientists in the development of sustainable cities, or what role does the earth scientists have when it comes to ensuring food security. So I think there is a dual function, and certainly listening to some of the talks here, I think there could be scope for an in-depth one book per SDG on the role of geoscience, but I think that's a project for somebody else to take forward.
Yeah, we did have a chat offline about, well, when's the next book coming out? And I think your reply was something along the lines of not for a long while.
Post-retirement, yeah, definitely.
So with that, I mean, we've had a number of talks earlier on this week. So, for example, with Rowan Thorne, who is an exploration geologist, but actually spending most of his time engaged with building trust and respect with the local communities in Liberia, which was the most recent piece of work that he had. And kind of really seeing that multidisciplinary, or kind of the different skill sets that people need to be able to have. Do you think that, obviously you've mapped to the SDGs, of course, of which there are 17. Is this something where geoscientists need to be really good at all of them, or are there some of the SDGs that are more prevalent to geoscientists?
I think there's lots of interactions between the SDGs. So of course somebody might be working very closely with the urban planning community and focused on sustainable cities, and somebody might be focused on responsible consumption and production and in the world of minerals. But of course, the building materials that we need for sustainable cities shows the link between those different goals. So I think I think individuals will obviously have specific contributions to the agenda that they can make. But I think one of the things that really comes across in the book is that it's also about how we work. And I think that cuts across all the goals. It's about our commitment to professional integrity, to ethics, to ensuring that the diverse environments in which we work in, and our community as geoscientists as a whole, is free of harassment and discrimination, is an inclusive environment. And these things are fundamental enablers of sustainable development. It can't just be that we do this thing to contribute to the goal, but it's also about how we do that. And I think that's, common sets of principles that really transcend different sub-disciplines within geoscience, different sectors, different focuses on specific goals, to really be about how we function and work as a community.
Great, thanks for that, Joel, because this is something where someone might be sitting there going, why on earth are we talking so much about geology and geoscience and everything? But of course, geoscience is the study of the ground, and the ground is where our raw materials start off their life, or at least their journey, and then of course we can go into recycling, etc. And just to point this out, so for every SDG, there's a really nice summary page where it says, okay, what is that SDG about? And then always the so what's with regards to the geoscience angle. And so trying to help with that interpretation, or I guess that translation, which I've certainly found very useful already. So thank you very much.
Yeah, they're free to download. If you go onto each of the chapters on the Springer website, you can actually access those infographics without needing to buy the book. Though of course you do want to buy the book to get all the detail and case studies, and yeah.
I like it how you started out saying you're not getting any royalties, but then quickly, oh no, but on behalf of the publisher, please do buy.
Well, I want people to buy it because I think the voices in the book, you know, hearing from Azura in Morocco through to Sylvia in Italy, talking about the role of gender equality, and Benson and Voda and Lydia and Elias from Zambia talking about food security. You know, this has been 4 years of their work to really look at the targets and look at what geoscience can do to these. So I think there's just so much exciting stuff in this book. The sense of kind of, you know, for me, having a geoscience book that is so global in its authorship, so diverse in its authorship, from senior professors to early career professionals, I think it gives a really exciting pitch as to where we could be as a community in terms of at the forefront of facilitating sustainable development. And I think the last chapter really brings together some of those recommendations, some of those next steps, what we need to do. So I think it's you know, it's worth investing the money to get this sense of what we could be doing as a community and what we may need to do to take that forward. Brilliant.
Thanks, Joel. So two last questions, if I may. So on Tuesday, we heard from Maria Capello, who took us through the Geophysics Atlas. Obviously, that uses the Sustainable Development Goals almost as the framework to be able to map the geophysics aspects into that. I'm assuming that there's a huge amount of collaboration, or at least support, between this book and, for example, some of the work that she's been up to.
Yeah, so I've been in meetings recently with Maria to look at how that geophysical study then can expand into looking at broader aspects of geoscience. And I think the book is really, you know, it's there to not address everything. It's there to catalyze further work, further engagement. As I said before, I think geoscientists have sometimes been on the periphery of some of these conversations, and I think the book really is trying to put geoscientists, you know, at the heart of sustainability discourse, create conversations, whether it's in the university lecture theatres, or whether it's in boardrooms, or whether it's at the heart of NGOs and public sector institutions around how geoscientists can play a role there. And I think, yeah, it's certainly working to get kind of like-minded individuals passionate about this issue together, and to share that beyond that group.
Brilliant, thank you. And final question, so COP26, which of course is happening later on this year, we hope, provided there's nothing to do with a global pandemic that gets in the way or delays it again. We heard earlier on today from the MP Alexander Stafford, who was talking about what an opportunity this is really for the UK as a whole. Are you involved in COP26 at all, Joel, or where do you see geoscience can be involved with regards to those global ambitions and that global push?
Yeah, I think it's really important that the geoscience community is at the heart of these forums. So if we've got time, very briefly, the UN also have another forum which is on science, technology and innovation for the Sustainable Development Goals. It takes place each year. It looks at what science is needed to deliver these ambitions and how we strengthen those networks. When I went in 2018, I was pretty much the only geoscientist in the room. They were talking about water, energy, sustainable cities, responsible consumption. And geoscientists just weren't turning up and just weren't part of those endeavors. And through the charity, we got there, we influenced, we got the aspects of geoscience captured into some of the key discussion there. And similarly, in 2019, we led an international delegation of early career Earth scientists from around the world to that forum to contribute. We've built on those links. We've applied for observer status with the UNFCCC as a charity so that we can engage more formally in COP26. The Geological Society of London has also been bringing together a range of different organisations from around the world to have a voice at that meeting to really profile the role of geosciences. And I think the survey are also looking at ways in which they can engage also. So I think there will be a geoscience presence. I think that's really important. I think also the links between climate and other aspects of work that geoscientists are involved in, whether it's around resilience to disasters, whether it's around groundwater resilience, and ensuring that we tackle the continuing problem of lack of access to clean water and sanitation, and then the knock-on impacts on girls' education, on income generation. The contributions of geoscientists are really invaluable. So we're working to be there, but to be there to influence, to be there to inform, to be there to ensure that geoscientists can contribute to the discussions that are taking place.
Fantastic. So what we've just heard in the last few minutes is not only a sales pitch, obviously, to go and buy the book, but also to come and study geoscience, ladies and gentlemen, because it's an awesome place to come and have a play. But I think as well with this, on behalf of geoscientists, but also people who work in raw materials, and actually almost to try and summarize some of what we've heard this morning, is that it's up to us to engage. So that's a case where there are these forums and just geoscientists weren't in there. And actually it's up to us to go and engage. We don't need to wait to be invited, because if we're not welcome, someone will soon tell us. But we need to step forward and just get involved. Would that be correct, Joel?
Absolutely. I think we've got to be proactive as geoscientists at being part of those interdisciplinary, multi-sector conversations. And I think one of the problems that potentially stops geoscientists from doing that is the way in which our training can be so siloed. So outside of minerals, but thinking of my work on disaster risk reduction when I was at university, there are people studying disasters from the perspective of social science, anthropology, engineering, architecture, but we were never brought together to exchange information, ideas, look at the different types of data and ways in which we interpret that collectively. And I think that very siloed way then feeds into how people work later on. And I think, again, one of the things the book does is really try to sit geoscience into the context of what others are doing, how others are working, to try and encourage people to pursue interdisciplinarity, build networks across disciplines, networks across sectors at the start of their career, so that becomes a normal way by which we work. And I think hopefully means that those sustainability forums and discussions aren't missing key disciplines such as geoscientists.
Great. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to invite you to put your hands together to say a massive, massive thanks to the fantastic Dr. Joel Gill. So thank you very much, Joel. That's brilliant and truly inspirational, not just for all the geoscientists involved on this call, but I think hopefully well beyond as well. So thank you very much.
Thanks for the opportunity to share. Much appreciated.
Brilliant. Thanks, Joel. So if I can now invite our speakers who are still with us to come and turn on their cameras again. And I'm actually just going to segue straight out of what Joel was saying there and come to Francis and ask. And so Joel mentioned that within many of our degrees, actually things are quite siloed and we don't necessarily get that insight across different departments, etc., within universities in those degrees. Do you think that there's, and also, I guess, with that, when the circular economy was first put together, there was no input arrow. And now, of course, looking at those diagrams, the business side of things say, hang on a second, that diagram doesn't work. Do you think that there's almost a change in the way in which universities can construct courses? Or ways in which students can get the most benefit out of universities when they're studying?
That's a very interesting question, Sarah. And so the first thing with a university is it's probably rooted in a discipline and will need to stay there to some extent. If you're studying engineering, then you want to come out with an engineering degree or a geology degree. But what I see is people putting in modules. For example, in our first year, the general engineering course at Exeter will have a challenge, which is a whole module in there. And that's an excellent place to put together the challenge of working across disciplines. And I think there are going to be more opportunities in the university syllabus to do that. And I think it's up to us who are running courses to put those kinds of things in. And at master's level at Camborne School of Mines, I can give an example. We have a new module called Mining the Future, where we just get the students to think about the future, and then we pull in speakers from different disciplines as well. They can hear a business school person talking and an expert from the USA on materials science and critical raw materials and critical materials cycles and things. And so we can bring those people in as guests as well. So different ways of structuring the courses. And I think that's what's important. So you don't just want a degree in, I don't know, maybe circular economy or something. You want to get these ideas and challenges seated in all of the disciplinary degrees. So, yeah, very interesting topic. See what happens next.
Great. So don't destroy the disciplines, but do make sure that there's the understanding within those disciplines of what's going on elsewhere, where you're getting the kind of cross-sector, etc. approach.
That's right. And the exposure to those difficult conversations, because it's not easy talking to a business person or a person in English about critical raw materials. But, yeah.
So talking about, I guess, speaking almost like across disciplines, Amanda, if I can maybe bring you in on a question here to say that, okay, so your talk was absolutely fantastic, but your role at the moment, and maybe you want to tell us a little bit about Arch and everything that you're doing, because this is something here where you've got the opportunity to take the might of the investing world and say, well, let's actually invest in a responsible manner within raw materials, etc. And so almost that involves bringing together people who don't necessarily talk they behave nicely together, but they don't necessarily understand one another. So does an investor truly understand what sustainability is all about, etc.? And how do you bring that together and make sure that everybody feels comfortable with it? Do you want to just discuss that?
I think that's what I was trying to discuss in my talk. Like, fundamentally, all of this demand for raw materials and the type of raw materials we want is coming from consumers. So we advise private equity in terms of investing sustainably in the raw materials space. So we make investments in a lot of mining companies, but also recycling and beneficiation. But we have much higher ESG standards, and we don't necessarily have those standards because, I mean, I'd like to think we're good moral people, but it's also because that's what our investors want from us. The kind of people that invest in private equity, they want to make money, but I think the world has decided that things like, in terms of things like impact investing, just like consumers, yes, they want renewable power, but they don't want it at any cost. Yes, the investing community wants to invest in the technology of the future, but they don't want to invest at any cost. And that translates into people like us who are specialist investors that invest in the raw materials space, in the resources space, to change the way in which we do what we do. And that means that we apply a lot of the tools that we've discussed here to our investing criteria. So we're no longer just looking for a mine that can make us a reasonable risk-adjusted return, because fundamentally that's what mining investors for the last 50 or 100 years have looked into. We're looking for a project or a mine that can give us a return within our boundaries of risk. But now, because of the new legislation in the world that we live in, as well as our investors, the people who are giving us that money to invest, because I wish I had that many millions of dollars, but I don't. So in investing on their behalf, they want me to apply more criteria to that investment, which means doing more work to ensure that not only am I going to get a good return, but I'm going to get that return in a sustainable way so that my investors and I can go to bed at night knowing that we haven't done something that makes us very uncomfortable. And increasingly across the world, not just in the mining sector, the investment community, whether that's public equity funds or endowment funds or private equity funds, all of that are being told that the sustainability of the resources and industries generally across the board that we're investing in, whether that's telecoms or farming or computer technology or AI, the way in which we invest in these industries needs to consider the overall impact it has on society of of where these industries are situated and how it's delivered. Sustainability is being, it's not just happening to raw materials. It's more at the coalface when it comes to raw materials, but it's happening to everything. It's a complete change in the way in which we invest, and that is fundamentally driven by the investors themselves and people.
Do you think, I mean, so this time last year, during the conference, there was quite a lot of chatter around people saying, you know what, all of this sustainability stuff is dead because the entire world's just going to be focusing in on COVID and the economic recovery that we will need. And in actual fact, what we've seen over the last 12 months, thank goodness, is almost the polar opposite to that happening. So it almost, I almost see that there's been like a massive increase in momentum as we see the investment world swinging into this space where there has to be sustainability involved. How soon do you think it's going to be before it truly is mainstream and a core part of all investment? Or do you think it's never going to be core to absolutely everything and we just need to get a majority there?
In the West, which is the world that most of us are, the Western developed world, all of our investing, as far as I'm concerned, it's done. It's there. It's already worked in. The EU Sustainable Investment Taxonomy is just one of an example, and that affects all investments, not just our industry, but it's already in. The Western world, the consumers and the people of the Western world via their governments have said that if you want to invest, you need to show me that you're doing it sustainably, whether that's investing in telecoms or mining, it doesn't matter. And the world kind of said, you know, we closed down, we've incurred more debt than we incurred during World War II. If we're going to build it back, we're going to build it back better. And this is the new world order. It's there, it's done. I don't think it's a question of how soon. I think we're already there. It's just we haven't necessarily figured it out. I don't think, and this has been a theme of this conference as well. We've talked about like 50 organizations and different taxonomies and frameworks and this and that. They're not joined up yet, but they're all part of a movement that's bigger than any individual industry that is here to stay.
Yeah. So with that, I've got a fairly cutting question for you that's come in from Jürgen, and he asks, how much reduction on either NPV, IRR, or whatever financial measurement you want to look for are investors willing to take to adhere to ESG standards?
Significant. I mean, it's not how much will they take in terms of a discount. Everybody has different thresholds of how much money they want to invest and what return they need from that money. If they don't get it from our industry, they'll get it someplace else. But I think it's not, I'll take a 5% discount on profits if you give it to me sustainably. It's this is the return level I need, and give it to me sustainably or don't. If I don't invest in you, I'll invest in someone else. And then the market will move with it. This happened, there was a couple of questions earlier. I think Ruth might have posed them, like, have companies said they'll pay more? The companies have said they're willing to pay more if necessary, but I don't think it's going to be necessary because the price is going to go up significantly. And the people that are going to pay, the people who are going to have the discounts are the people that don't produce sustainably, because nobody will buy their product.
Thanks for that, Amanda. That is a brilliant little soundbite that you just gave us there. If they don't do it, no one's going to buy it. So brilliant. I'm just going to turn to the rest of our panel now. And I think one of the recurring themes that we've seen this morning is where do people need to get involved, or almost where people have been surprised by, well, as Alexander Stafford said this morning, this time last year, nobody in Westminster was talking about raw materials at all. It just wasn't a topic of conversation. And there's been a huge push over the last year with the likes of the Critical Minerals Association, and we're going to hear from them on Friday, around really trying to push forwards the message in terms of where raw materials, etc., fits into this broad picture, and why, say, members of government should actually be interested in all of this. So I'm just going to go around our panel, and Michael, perhaps if I start off with yourself and ask, could you give an example of where over the last however many years you felt that you had to get involved with something, either to just make people aware or cause a change or cause disruption, or have you gone about it in a different way? So the topic is, where have you had to actively get involved or cause disruption? Michael, over to you, and then we'll go to Jeff.
The one that springs to mind is probably in EITI. So this is going back quite a few years to my time at BG Group, when there was this kind of swirling around this feeling that, as it was expressed at the time, revenue transparency, but kind of and tax transparency was somehow important. There was lots of things happening, but the company, others, and not just BG Group, but the industry generally, was not really too sure what to do about it. There was this thing called the ITI, which was still kind of in fairly nascent form then. And so personally at BG Group, I kind of had to pull this together and kind of shape BG's response to it and get kind of internal buy-in to kind of really, and also kind of encourage as much as you could other, and work within the industry to kind of encourage and to kind of take it more seriously, but actually, you know, kind of engage fully on the fully with EITI. So that's the example that I can think of in more recent past. On specifically on beneficial ownership, I suppose it's really kind of encouraging companies. For example, Tim and I have spoken at kind of done a number of workshops where the question we get asked from some in industry is, why is this important? Why should I declare my beneficial owner? You know, what's this got to do? And Amanda asked earlier about privacy and confidentiality and personal safety, and those are concerns and there are issues, but there are ways to address those. And so it's really kind of saying, well, look, this is why I'm not going to go into the arguments now, but beneficial ownership is important. It is about, you know, knowing who you're, ultimately it's about knowing who you're doing business with and getting a higher degree of comfort that they are acting responsibly and are not one of the bad guys.
Great, thanks for that, Michael. Jeff, how about yourself? And then we'll go to Mark.
I mean, I would say that the last 18 months, the supplier due diligence angle has been how we've been trying to kind of get into things. I mean, we created, you know, our original focus has always been on economic development. We're an international development organization, but as much as I'd love it for investors and northern stakeholders to care about economic development in Africa, for example, the reality is, as a consumers and ESG, they really care about risk mitigation. So I will say that in the last 18 months or so, I mean, the real big focus in the angle we've been trying to play with is certainly around, and I mean, to be blunt, not getting sued. I mean, that's just what motivates people, right? In terms of mining companies buying from suppliers, or for that matter, end users buying from mining companies, right? We have been, I guess, frustrated in the sense that the responsible sourcing dialogue about mining always sort of portrays the mining supply chain as ending at the mine, as in, as long as the mine doesn't have child labor, therefore it's fine. But that doesn't make sense, given more than half of all economic value during mining is upstream in procurement. So we've been trying to play that angle quite a lot in trying to disrupt, shall we say, the OECD due diligence conversation. And for that matter, I would say we've been trying to do the same thing with standards like PERC and the National Instrument 43-101. I mean, we're very frustrated with those standards in the sense that they don't incorporate how many economic benefits are going to be created. And to me, it's quite crazy that you could have a mining project which seems to go ahead on the technical merits, but I mean, if you can't demonstrate that it's going to create many jobs, you're at a major risk of social license and it being blocked. And we're seeing that over and over and over and over in Canada, especially. So anyway, that's another angle we've been trying to disrupt things, shall we say.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Mark, how about yourself? And then we'll go to Tim.
Well, I guess the two things that I've noticed is the university students that I lecture, they have a much more increased interest in a global or a systematic approach to mining. So it's not just a case of blowing up rocks and big yellow trucks anymore. It's how is this going to impact into the communities? A lot of questions that get asked by the students that I've been lecturing to are, well, how's it going to impact the local community? Isn't all that value just going to flow back to the West? What I've been seeing coming from a country or a continent where there's a lot of mining activity is what I find very interesting in the developed world, this demand for going green, but I guess to sound controversial, this utter lack of understanding where this material is coming from, where it's sourced from. You can talk about going 2 degrees Celsius and everything else, but we have to mine those metals and materials and get it done. Something Amanda's alluded to is some of the primary stuff we don't think about and impacts that has, sand and cement. It's all very well and good, for example, to shut down coal-fired power stations, but then you start having an impact in the cement manufacturing industry. The same thing, we need all this infrastructure for wind turbines and plinths for solar panels, but we need sand for that, and that's leading to some rather nasty downstream developments in poor emerging economies where the only thing that they've got to export is the beach and river sands. So there's a lot more things, the social economic things that actually are bubbling under, which I think we're going to start seeing coming up in the future as well.
Great, thank you, Mark. Tim, let's come to you next, and then we'll go to Amanda.
Thanks, Sarah. I mean, I could talk about tax transparency and the fact that I was involved in the policy debates around that at the time that all the Google, Starbucks, etc. stuff happened after the global financial crisis, and I think we've got another wave of that coming post-COVID. But more kind of relevant specifically to this conference, I mean, historically, the debate around beneficial ownership transparency has been rooted very much in NGOs, in civil society, lobbying governments to end opaque ownership structures, complex ownership structures, and undisclosed interests. And then governments have maybe made a commitment to do something about that, but then not necessarily known what to do next, have either the resources or the expertise, particularly in parts of the developing world, to then take that forward and actually do something about it. So one of the things Michael and I are trying to do actually at the moment is move that dial a little bit to say, actually that debate should be something that is across all stakeholder groups, including the private sector, and should move beyond just putting pressure on governments to do something into actually practically saying, well, what is it that governments really need in order to be able to do it? What is the expertise that they need? What are the resources that they need in order to be able to make that change? Because I think part of the challenge at the moment in the area that we work is that there's a lot of well-established campaigning and lobbying. What there isn't necessarily is as much to follow that up and help governments that actually want to commit to improving governance around the extractive sector or other areas to then actually practically do it. So I think that's kind of a one that's really current, if you like, and I think is only going to become more current in the wake of COVID and some of the challenges there have been around procurement and potential sort of corruption around procurement, etc., and increased focus on where governments and how governments have spent money over the course of the last couple of years, and whether or not really governments understand who's behind some of the companies. I mean, we've got that question being raised currently in the UK, but I'm sure that those questions are coming up all around the world in terms of how exactly have governments been spending money over the last 12 months and whose pockets have that got into. So that's kind of a current one, I suppose.
Thanks, Tim. Brilliant. Amanda, over to yourself, and then we'll finish with Francis.
Yeah, thank you. I think that I see a stakeholder in this, as I mentioned before, that a lot of people don't consider when they're having these big stakeholder frameworks. They forget the end stakeholder, the massive stakeholder, and that is people. the people of the world. And the people of the world can express what they desire in two ways: how they spend their money and what they do, and in terms of who they elect in a democratic society, and the rules that they want to live under. Ultimately, government legislation is pushed by people, and buying decisions are made by people as a whole. That's the market, that's our market, that's how it works. And those people have been super, super clear. They want ESG, which is environmental social governance, and governance basically means transparency in their governments and in all the products and businesses that are in our society. And so slowly but surely, it's top down almost. We will all figure it out because we don't have a choice. And I think that that's becoming clear in our industry and which legislation, which standards, that is still to be determined. I think it'll be partially be the market. It'll be that push, pull, and try, figure out which works best. But eventually we will consolidate. And I don't actually have an idea about which standards that's going to be. But I think the many standards will come together into an operating regime that is clear. And then it goes to the next bit, which is, and I think an example works best here, a picture, as someone said earlier. There was a Glencore trader who I was speaking to a while ago, and he said he had new rules. He needed to know what the ESG, he needed to know the provenance, he needed to know the carbon footprint, and the standards that this product that he was buying to trade on the international metals market had. And if the mine that wanted to offtake to him couldn't provide that, he simply had to go elsewhere. So that mine could only then go to people that didn't have standards and were willing to pay him a much lower price. So if they wanted to trade on the market that we all live in, that consumers in our world are in, he couldn't even accept the product, forget the price. So there's a market for sustainable, the market in the West is for sustainable products. And it's trickling down all the way to the miners, and they'll either come up to it or they'll have to sell at a much lower price or not at all into a different market that we're not all a part of. But the market, as far as we're all concerned, is for sustainability going forward. The problem is the definition of sustainability isn't quite written in stone yet, but it's getting closer to being written in stone every day.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Amanda. And passing to Frances for your input.
Thank you. Yes, so I think my disruptor then, what's made me think is that often when we're talking about ESG and responsible raw materials, responsible sourcing, we're talking about what other people and other governments and companies should be doing who are working abroad all over the world. And so I'm sitting in Cornwall at the moment, and besides our China clay operations, we have half a dozen really exciting exploration projects for metals. And I think that's made me think about, okay, are we just assuming that it's all good because it's here in the UK, or are we really doing best practice? And I think that's a challenge. So that's our disruptor, is to work with our regional authority, Cornwall Council and so on, because they don't have time to come to a week of responsible raw materials. They're not in this space at all. They're hard-pressed people with huge job descriptions of things to get done. And so how do we're trying to interact with them. Can we pick up one of these United Nations ECE framework classifications and materials management, responsible materials systems? Actually, we're talking to Mark Burnett, who's on this call as well, about his experience of those codes and things. And I think we need to make sure that even close to home, we're really using the ESG toolbox and promoting that real sustainable and responsible raw materials, actually, you know, walk the walk as well as talk the talk here. So that's my disruptor that we need to do.
Brilliant. Thanks, Frances. So just to try and wrap all of this together, I mean, I think what I heard there was some brilliant ideas, but the pervading theme of saying, okay, we actually need to step up and get involved, and where we see something that could be disrupted, then go do it. And we can always apologise later, whilst we're saying we probably don't need yet another sustainability standard. If you really want to write one, go for it and do it, because it's still in that sugarling phase of saying, well, actually, what is needed where. Also, with regards to that, as Amanda said, that stakeholder of the global population and people, which includes us. So every single one of us is a person, I think. And so therefore, it's also holding ourselves to account. Francis, a little bit like what you were saying there. It's like actually hold ourselves to account and say, okay, yes, fine, I'm doing my recycling, but more than that, and saying, what's my sphere of influence? And are there any levers that I can pull or can nudge to try and actually make a difference in this space? Because that's what's needed. As was said by our first speaker this morning, our Member of Parliament, Alexander Stafford, he said, this time a year ago, nobody knew about this stuff. So what's needed, especially in the run up to COP26, is pressure. And so that's a request from a member of government to say, actually, we just need to increase the noise level about this. But more than that, it's not just noise, it's actually doing something and creating action and perhaps creating change. One of the reasons why all of us are here in the Responsible Raw Materials Forum is because a couple of years ago, and it was actually on Hogmanay, and being Scottish, that's quite a big deal for me, a very quick website was put together called Responsible Reserves, and in it, it said, what if we really did include ESG in the likes of PERC? So what if geologists actually included ESG properly as a factor when we're determining what might be included in those mineral resources and reserve statements? Now, that was done fairly naively because there was a huge amount of work that was already going on in this space. But what it served to do was ask the question and instigate debate and help with the momentum of the direction of the action that was already being taken. So it's really exciting to see that the disruption actually does work, and all of us stepping up and getting involved also is what is actually needed and being called for at the moment. So finally, in closing, I think just leaning on what Joel said, and I think he's had to go off to be a daddy. And he was saying there, you know, until very recently, there were all these forums that didn't have the right people necessarily involved. So if you see something happening and you think, hang on a second, why haven't I been invited? Then pick up the phone and ask to be invited, which is really scary, I think, for lots and lots of people, but actually that's what makes a difference. And so on behalf of Rose, myself and the organising committee for this conference, a lot of people who are speaking this week were people who actually got in touch with us and said, hey, can I say something, please? And that was absolutely brilliant because it helped us to expand that network. So finally, in closing, this afternoon, so in a few hours' time, we have got another session. So session number 7. Okay, we're almost there, Rose, we're almost there. And it is jam-packed this afternoon. So we're starting at 3 o'clock UK time with Sarah Caven. Now, she gave one of the most cited talks of last year. So I should also say, in terms of, to Francis's point, very few people have enough time in their diary to dial into an entire conference, which is one of the reasons why we're taking everybody's talks and putting them into these bite-sized chunks. So if you've heard a talk that you think, oh, that was really interesting this week, somebody else needs to know about it, all of the talks have their own individual URLs. So feel free to share those talks with those people who you think need to listen to them, because nobody's going to sit and watch hours and hours of a conference. We're not deluding ourselves with that. Please do share all of that with everybody. But this afternoon, some fantastic talks coming through. So we've got Sarah Caven and then John Thompson, a giant in the world of geology, and coming to talk to us. Remy Peet, who's going to be speaking more on the social side. We've got Sarah Webber, Carly Becker, who's going to talk about product stewardship, into Nicholas Arndt, who I can see is part of our attendees this morning. So Nick, we really look forward to hearing your talk later on. We've got Heather De Quincey and Catherine McCallum, who are going to be talking again more on the social side of things. Then Aileen Duran, who's going to be talking about diversity in this space. So how do we make sure we get that diverse thought and also diverse people involved in this space? then into Rob Capati, and finally we're finishing with Tom Butler, who until recently was CEO of the International Council for Mining and Metals. So we'll see what he talks to us about now that he is free of the ICMM. I'm sure he will still be great on the message with regards to that, but Tom will help us wrap up this afternoon session with great insight into the world of mining. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a final round of applause for our fantastic speakers and our panel for this morning's session. A massive thanks from the bottom of our hearts, and good luck with the rest of your day and week. Thank you very much. And the recordings will be posted